It was the spring of 2021, and I had traveled to a small cabin near Helvetia, West Virginia for a short break. The place felt peaceful at first. I'm Daniel, 44 years old, and I work as a field biologist studying invasive plant species for the National Park Service. I'd been on assignment in Maryland for 6 months straight and needed a reset. My friend Karen owned a cabin in the mountains near Helvetia, a tiny community in Randolph County that was originally settled by Swiss immigrants. She offered me the place for 2 weeks, no charge, just get away and decompress. The cabin was perfect for that. 1 room, a wood stove, a sleeping loft, and a porch that looked out over a heavily forested valley. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. Self-service was non-existent. It was exactly what I needed. I spent the first few days hiking the old logging roads, reading books I'd been meaning to get to, and generally doing nothing productive. It felt good. On the 4th day, I decided to explore the forest directly behind the cabin. There was no trail, just dense hardwood forest with thick undergrowth. I pushed through mountain laurel and rhododendron, following a small creek that ran downhill about a 1/4 mile from the cabin. I found the tree. It was a massive oak, easily 12 feet in circumference, with bark so deeply furrowed it looked like the surface of a rocky cliff. But what caught my attention was the door. Not a natural formation, not a hollow caused by rot or animal damage. An actual door carved into the bark. It was about 4 feet tall and 2 feet wide, with a smooth rectangular outline cut deep into the wood. The edges were precise, almost surgical, and in the center of the door, at roughly chest height, was a small carved symbol that looked like 3 interlocking circles. I stood there staring at it for a long time. The rational part of my brain tried to explain it as some kind of folk art or historical marker, but the craftsmanship was too refined, too deliberate. Someone had spent hours carving this door into living wood, and they had done it with purpose. I reached out and touched the surface. The wood was warm, warmer than it should have been given the cool spring air. I tried to find a seam or edge I could grip, some way to open it, but the door was seamless. It appeared to be carved in relief, not actually a functional door at all. I took photos with my phone, though I knew I wouldn't have service to send them to anyone. I measured the tree, estimated its age at over 100 years, and marked the location on my paper map. Then I hiked back to the cabin. That night I couldn't stop thinking about the door. I'd spent my entire career studying trees and had never seen anything like it. The precision of the carving suggested metal tools, probably recent, but the weathering of the wood suggested it had been there for decades, maybe longer. And that symbol, 3 interlocking circles, it meant something. I was sure of it. The next morning I went back to the tree. The door was still there, unchanged, but something else had appeared. Scattered around the base of the tree were small objects: a rusted pocket watch, a glass marble, a tarnished silver spoon, a child's wooden toy, carved in the shape of a horse. They were arranged in a circle round the trunk, each item placed with obvious care. I picked up the pocket watch. The back was engraved with initials, JTH. The crystal was cracked, and the hands were frozen at 3:17. I set it back down exactly where I'd found it. The marble was clear glass with a blue spiral inside. The spoon had an ornate handle with a pattern I didn't recognize. The wooden horse was worn smooth by handling, its paint long faded. These were old things, personal things, but who had placed them here and why? I decided to stake out the tree. I found a spot about 50 yards uphill where I could watch without being obvious, and I settled in to wait. I brought water, snacks, and my binoculars. I told myself I'd give it 2 hours. For hours passed. Nothing happened. The forest was quiet except for the usual bird calls and the sound of wind moving through the canopy. I was about to give up when I saw movement. A woman appeared from downhill, walking slowly through the undergrowth. She was older, maybe 70, dressed in a long dark coat despite the mild weather. She carried a small cloth bag. She approached the tree, knelt down, and spent several minutes arranging something I couldn't quite see. Then she stood, placed her hand flat against the door, and spoke. I was too far away to hear the words, but her lips moved for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she turned and walked back the way she'd come. I waited until she was out of sight before approaching the tree. A new item had been added to the circle, a photograph in a plastic sleeve. The image showed a young man in military uniform, smiling at the camera. On the back, written in pencil, Thomas Hutchins, 1968. I sat down with my back against the tree and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. This was clearly some kind of memorial or shrine. But why here? Why this tree? And what was the significance of the carved door? That evening I drove into Helvetia, the tiny community about 9 miles from the cabin. There was a general store that doubled as a post office and community center. An elderly man named Walter was behind the counter. I asked him if he knew anything about a carved tree in the forest. A big oak with a door carved into it. Walter's expression changed immediately. He set down the can of soup he'd been pricing and looked at me carefully. "You've been out to the Mercy Tree," he said. It wasn't a question. Is that what it's called? I asked. He nodded slowly. Been there longer than anyone can remember. Some folks say it was carved by the first settlers, Swiss folks, who came here in the 1860s. Others say it's older than that. Indians maybe, though that don't quite fit with the style of carving. What's it for? I asked. Walter shrugged. Folks leave things there when they want something kept safe. Memories mostly. Things they don't want to forget but can't keep with them. The tree takes care of them. Takes care of them how? He looked at me like I'd asked a very stupid question. By keeping them, he said. By holding onto them. You leave something at the Mercy Tree, it stays there. Safe, protected, remembered. I thanked Walter and drove back to the cabin. That night I lay in the loft, unable to sleep, thinking about what he'd said. A tree that held memories. A tree that kept things safe. It was a beautiful idea, poetic even. But it didn't explain the door or the symbol or the feeling I'd had when I touched the warm wood. The next morning I went back to the tree one final time. The circle of objects had grown. There were now at least 20 items, more photographs, pieces of jewelry, a small Bible, a baby's booty, a military medal. Each one represented someone's memory, someone's loss, someone's need to remember. I knelt down and studied the door again. This close, I could see faint marks on the surface that I'd missed before. Scratches like fingernails dragged across wood. And beneath those scratches, barely visible, were words carved in tiny letters. What we give, it keeps. What it keeps, we cannot take. I reached out and placed my palm flat against the door, the way the old woman had done. The wood was warm, almost hot, and for just a moment, I felt something beneath my hand. A vibration, a pulse, like the slow, steady beating of a heart. I pulled my hand back and stood up quickly. I left the Mercy Tree and hiked back to the cabin. I packed my things that afternoon and drove home 3 days earlier than planned. Karen texted me later asking if everything had been okay with the cabin. I told her it was perfect, that I just needed to get back to work. But that's not true. The truth is I couldn't stay near that tree any longer, because I'd felt it. I'd felt something alive inside that oak, something waiting behind that door. And I knew with absolute certainty that if I stayed longer, if I kept visiting that tree, I would eventually feel compelled to leave something there myself. Some memory I needed to keep safe. Some part of myself I couldn't afford to lose. And once I did that, once I gave something to the Mercy Tree, I don't think I would ever be able to take it back. I'm 34 years old. I took a long weekend. Figured I'd hit the mountains, camp a little, hike a little, let my brain deflate. Just me, the trees, and silence. That sounded perfect. I picked this trail I'd read about on some hiking forum. Ridgeway Loop. People said it was a moderate hike with a few good overlooks. And best part, not a lot of foot traffic. Honestly, that last bit sold me. I wasn't in the mood to make small talk with strangers in moisture-wicking shorts. I tossed my gear in the back of my old Jeep before sunrise and drove 5 hours. The towns got smaller, the roads got narrower. And then finally, it was just me and green hills rolling like waves. I could almost feel the stress unclenching from my shoulders as I drove deeper in. When I pulled up to the trailhead, the lot was empty. Not another car in sight. Normally, I'm not thrilled about total isolation because, serial killers. But that day, it felt like a gift. I parked, stretched, checked my map, and hoisted on my pack. The air hit me first, cool, clean, and sharp like it had never been breathed by anyone before. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about work, wasn't thinking about anything but how good it felt just to be out there. The first couple of miles were easy. The trail wound through these tall, straight trees, their trunks like pillars holding up the sky. The ground was soft with old leaves, the kind that crunch just enough to remind you you're out in the wild, but not so much that you feel like an intruder. By midday, I came across a little creek with water so clear it looked fake. Figured that was my sign to set up camp. I pitched the tent, boiled some noodles on my camp stove, and ate sitting on a flat rock. The only sound was water sliding over stones. No cars, no voices, no endless hum of computers. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you wonder why you live any other way. That night, I made a small fire and stared at it until the stars blinked on. It felt good, simple, like life had dialed back to something I could handle. When my eyes started to droop, I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and let stillness swallow me whole. The next morning, I woke up early. The air had that sharp bite that makes you feel alive. So, I grabbed a light day pack with some water and snacks and decided to hike higher up the ridge to Finn. One of those overlooks the map bragged about. The climb was steeper than I expected, but my legs were eating it up. My lungs burned in the good way. And for a while, I forgot why I'd even come out there in the first place. That was until the trail markers disappeared. At first, I figured I just missed one. No big deal. I walked back a few steps, scanned the trees for that bright orange blaze. Nothing. I shrugged. Trails don't just end, right? The dirt path was still under my boots, worn and clear, so I trusted it. That's when it got weird. The first thing I saw was the rope just hanging from a tree branch like some old sad noose. It looked wrong. The rope was frayed, blackened like it had been through a fire. The branch above it was scorched in this perfect ring, as if Simeon had set a torch to just that spot and walked away. I stood there staring at it way too long, thinking, who does that? Who burns one branch and leaves the rope? I kept moving, but slower now. The next thing was bones scattered across the dirt, pale ashok. Not a full skeleton, just pieces. A rib, something that looked like a femur, except it was too long. Stretched thin in a way that didn't look right. My brain said deer, my gut said no. After that, the silence changed. It didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like it had weight pressing on my ears. Even my footsteps sounded wrong. Too sharp, too loud, like they didn't belong there. That's when I told myself enough. You've seen plenty. Time to head back. So I turned around and realized nothing behind me looked the same. The slope was steeper. The trees were closer, crowded like they were leaning in, boxing me. I couldn't see the rope, couldn't see the bones, couldn't see anything familiar. And then I heard it. Not footsteps, not an animal. Breathing, slow, deliberate breathing, dragging air like it was syrup. Then the exhale, wet and ragged, like it was scraping something raw inside. I froze, every muscle locked. It came again, closer this time. And then something else. A low mumble. Not words I knew. Just broken sounds. Like someone trying to copy human speech and failing. My skin went cold. Every instinct in me screamed torn, but I couldn't move. Not until I heard the third sound. Wood creaking like something huge shifting its weight against a tree. I bolted. Branches slapped my arms, snapped against my face, but I didn't care. My lungs burned. My legs begged to quit, but I didn't stop. I didn't even know if I was in a trail anymore. I just kept moving, tearing through underbrush, heart hammering like it wanted out. Then blew my tarp, my campsite. I stumbled into the clearing, grabbed my pack with shaking hands, and didn't bother with tent. Didn't put out the fire. I just slung the straps over my shoulders and ran downhill like the forest was collapsing behind me. And then I made the mistake of looking back. Up the ridge, between the trees, something stood. It was tall, too tall. Its head nearly brushed the branches. Its arms hung past its knees, long and thin, like someone had stretched them wrong. Its skin was the color of wet bark, and its head tilted at an angle no neck should allow. Cocked like a dog hearing something it doesn't understand. Then its mouth opened. No roar, no growl, just my name drawn out in a voice that sounded broken, dragged over teeth, mangled into something almost human. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes of green, the taste of blood in me mouth from biting my tongue. the pounding in my skull as I ran. I didn't stop until the trees spat me out onto a gravel road. By the time I stumbled into the ranger station, I was half delirious. They told me I'd gone 7 miles off any marked trail. Asked if I'd seen bears. It just shook my head. I didn't tell them what I saw. Didn't have the words. I got in my Jeep and drove until those mountains were just a smear in my rear view. During the winter of 2018, something happened to me in the mountains around Spruce Pine, North Carolina, that I still struggle to explain. I had come there for a surveying contract, and it changed the way I see these hills forever. My name is Jennifer, I'm 36, and I work as a professional land surveyor. A law firm in Asheville hired me to survey a disputed property boundary in Mitchell County. Two families, the Morgans and the Pratts, had been arguing over a piece of land for 3 generations. The case was finally going to court, and they needed an official survey to settle the matter. The property was remote, accessible only by a logging road that hadn't been maintained in years. Both families had old deeds that described the boundary using landmarks that no longer existed. A lightning-struck chestnut, a stone cairn, an old fence line. My job was to use GPS technology and historical records to determine where the actual legal boundary should be. I set up a base camp in my truck at the end of the logging road and started working. The weather was cold, with patches of snow on the ground and more in the forecast. I had maybe for days to complete the survey before conditions would make it impossible. The first day was routine. I established control points, took measurements, and began mapping the terrain. The disputed area was a narrow strip of forest, maybe 40 acres, that ran along a ridge line. On one side was Morgan property, on the other was Pratt property, and in between was this contested zone that neither family had clear title to. On the second day, I found the first marker dot. It was a metal stake, about 3 feet tall, driven deep into the ground. The top was painted bright orange, and there was a small metal tag riveted to it with a number stamped into the metal, 001. I checked my historical records. The stake wasn't mentioned in any of the old surveys. It wasn't on any map, but it looked official, professionally placed. I marked its location on my GPS and continued working. An hour later, I found another one. Same design, same bright orange paint, numbered 002. This one was about 200 yards from the first, deeper into the forest dot. By the end of the day, I'd found 7 stakes, numbered sequentially, running in a rough line that didn't correspond to either the Morgan or Pratt property boundaries. These stakes marked something else entirely. That night I called the law firm and asked if there had been any previous surveys I hadn't been told about. The attorney I spoke with was confused. She checked the file and confirmed that my survey was the first professional one, commissioned for this property. There should be no other markers out there. The next morning I decided to follow the line of stakes and see where they led. I found 008, then 009, then 010. They were spaced irregularly, sometimes close together, sometimes hundreds of yards apart, but they definitely formed a line, a border marking something. Stake 015 was different. It was taller, maybe 6 feet, and instead of orange paint, it was wrapped in red tape. At the base of the stake was a metal box, the kind utilities companies use to protect equipment. I opened it. Inside was a logbook, a simple spiral notebook with a plastic cover to keep it dry. The first entry was dated September 1993, written in neat handwriting. Initial survey complete. Boundary established per Protocol 7. Markers placed at critical points. Monitor quarterly. There were dozens of entries after that, spanning 25 years. Different handwriting, different people, but all following the same format. Each entry noted the date, confirmed the markers were intact, and mentioned Protocol 7. The last entry was from October 2017, just over a year before I'd arrived. I flipped to the back of the notebook. Someone had drawn a map showing the complete line of markers. There were 48 stakes total, forming a rough oval that enclosed about 200 acres of forest. The disputed Morgan Pratt property was entirely within this oval dot at the bottom of the map. In capital letters, containment boundary, do not cross. I closed the logbook and sat down on a fallen tree. My survey had just become significantly more complicated. There was clearly something going on here that I hadn't been told about. Some kind of environmental study or forestry management project. But why hadn't the law firm mentioned it? And why was it being kept in a weatherproof box in the middle of the forest? Instead of filed with the county, I decided to walk the entire boundary. If I was going to complete my survey, I needed to understand what these markers represented and whether they had any legal bearing on the property dispute. I found all 48 stakes over the next 2 days. Each one was precisely placed and carefully maintained. Some were in difficult terrain, on steep slopes or in thick underbrush. But whoever had installed them had gone to considerable effort to mark this boundary clearly. The last stake, number 048, was back near where I'd found the first one, completing the circuit. And next to it was something I hadn't noticed before, a stone marker, much older than the metal stakes, carved with words I could barely make out, sealed by order. 1891. I took photographs of everything and hiked back to my truck. That night I did research on my laptop. Using the spotty cell service I could occasionally get at the top of the ridge, I searched for Protocol 7, containment boundaries, and anything related to forestry management in Mitchell County. I found nothing. On my last day, I completed the legal survey of the Morgan-Pratt boundary. I had all the data I needed for my report, but I couldn't stop thinking about those stakes, that logbook, that old stone marker. I decided to make one more trip to the red-taped stake and read through the entire logbook carefully. I found the box and opened it. The logbook was gone. In its place was a new note, written on a piece of paper and sealed in a plastic bag. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. You have been inside the boundary for days. Standard protocol requires notification. You will be contacted. Do not discuss the markers with anyone. Do not include them in your report. My hands were shaking as I read it. Someone had been watching me. Someone had seen me find the stakes, read the logbook, and walk the boundary. And now they were telling me to keep quiet about it. I left immediately. I drove straight to Asheville and submitted my survey report, making no mention of the mysterious stakes or containment boundary. The law firm was satisfied. The Morgan-Pratt case was settled based on my findings. But 3 days later, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. A man's voice, calm and professional, asked if I was the surveyor who had recently worked in Mitchell County. I said yes. He thanked me for my discretion regarding the markers I'd found. He said the boundary I'd discovered was part of a long-term environmental monitoring project, studying the migration patterns of a rare fungal species. He said the project was confidential due to concerns about bioprospecting and illegal harvesting. He asked if I had any questions. I had 100 questions, but I only asked one. What happens if someone crosses the boundary? There was a long pause. Nothing happens, he finally said. The boundary is purely for research purposes. It has no legal standing. Then why the containment protocols? I asked, why the secrecy? Another pause. The boundary keeps people out. He said slowly, that's all you need to know. He hung up before I could respond. I've thought about that conversation every day since. I've thought about those 48 stakes forming an oval in the forest. I've thought about the logbook entries spanning decades, always monitoring, always checking. I've thought about that 1891 stone marker, sealed by order. And I keep coming back to the same question. If the boundary keeps people out, what exactly is it keeping in? I was hiking a remote stretch of trail down in southern West Virginia when it happened. I'd been planning the trip 4 weeks. I needed that. I parked at the trailhead around 900 in the morning. Blue sky, cool air that hit like a wake-up slap. The first few miles were easy. Gentle slopes, big stretches where you can see forever through the trees. Birds chattering like they had gossip to share. I remember thinking, this is perfect. Like I'd picked the exact right spot to disappear for a bit. By early afternoon, I passed this old fire tower. Totally out of use, all rusted and broken, like something left behind after the world ended. Its metal frame stuck up through the treine, and for some reason, I thought about climbing it just for the view. I didn't. Something about it felt wrong, like if I touched it, the whole thing would come down on top of me. So I kept walking. That's when I noticed the footprints. At first, it didn't register. The trail had been empty all day. No parked cars where I started. No hikers passing by. So when I saw them, I stopped. They were in the soft patch of mud where water must have pulled after rain. Looked like boot prints at a glance, but when I crouched down, something about them made my stomach flip. The heel was too narrow. The toes stretched out long like someone had pulled the front of the boot like taffy. And the tread. God, that tread was warped. Not worn down like old shoes, but twisted, melted. Almost like heat had messed with the pattern and left it warped in the dirt. And the worst part, they were fresh. Edge sharp, soil still damp inside the grooves. Whoever left them wasn't far. It told myself it was nothing. Maybe some hunter with custom boots. Maybe even just a weird angle messing with my eyes. Still, my brain wouldn't shut up about it. So I picked up the pace. By 4, I hit a fork. One trail dipped toward a stream. The other climbed a ridge. The map said the shelter was up past the ridge. So I started climbing. Each step felt heavier, like my pack had doubled in weight. The higher I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of my boots and my own heartbeat drumming behind my ribs. Halfway up, I stopped cold. The footprints were back. Same warped shape, same freaky narrow heel and stretch toe. Except this time they were ahead of me again. Sunk deep into the mud like something heavier had walked through. I followed them a little, just trying to make sense of it. And then they just stopped right there in the middle of the trail. No rocks toast upon, no other tracks leading off. Just gone like the thing or person walked 10 feet in front of me and then evaporated. I stood there way too long, just staring, waiting for my brain to offer some kind of explanation. All I kept thinking was, things don't just vanish. When I finally reached the ridge, the sun was bleeding out fast. The shelter sat in this clearing. Weathered, old, but solid. Roof still in. Big wooden platform for sleeping. A blackened fire ring out front. No sign of anyone else. That should make me feel better. It didn't. I dropped my pack and went through the motions. Filter water, boil noodles, hang the food bag in a tree like you're supposed to. Everything felt mechanical, like I was just playing at being calm. By the time I crawled into me sleeping bag, night had swallowed the whole clearing. I must have fallen asleep because the sound hit me out of nowhere. Soft, dragging, slow, like something brushing along the outside wall of the shelter. I froze. My breathing went shallow on instinct, like that would make me invisible. Whatever it was circled the shelter step by step. I could feel the vibrations in the wood under me. When it got to the back wall, the sound changed. Sharp hollow pops like two stones knocking together in an uneven rhythm. Click, 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 pause, then silence. I don't know how long I laid there before reaching for my headlamp. My hands shook so bad I couldn't hit the switch at first. When the beam finally cut through the dark, I swept it across the clearing. And that's when I saw it just at the edge of thelite. Tall to tall. Its body was stretched out, limbs hanging long with joints bending in ways joints shouldn't bend. Skin pale and tight like plastic wrap over sticks. And the head, that's what burned into me. Narrow at the top, wide at the jaw, and a mouth full of teeth catching the light. Even thought's lips weren't moving. It tilted its head slow and sharp like a bird. And then the clicking started again, but its mouth stayed shut. The sound wasn't just coming from it anymore. It was in the trees, in the ground, everywhere. It moved backward, slow toward my pack. Never took my eyes off it. Every step felt like an hour. The thing didn't move, just stood there, head twitching in these tiny jerky motions, like it was studying me, deciding something. When my hand hit the straps, I grabbed the pack and ran. I didn't even try to find the trail. I plowed straight into the trees, crashing through brush, branches ripping at my clothes. Behind me, snaps, cracks, too many for one thing. The clicking followed louder, faster until it sounded like 100 teeth chattering in the dark. I don't know how long I ran. My legs felt like fire. My legs turned to hollow sticks. When I stumbled into a stream, I didn't even think. I just waded in up to my knees and followed it downstream. Water freezing against my skin until I saw the glint of a guardrail through the trees. When I climbed up onto that road, my legs nearly gave out. A truck came by a boot an hour later. Driver didn't ask much, just stared at me through the rear view while I shook in the back seat like a busted engine. I never went back for my gear. 2 days later, a ranger called. They found my food bag still hanging in the tree, but not the shelter. I thought he meant it burned down. Nope. He said there was nothing there. I spent the summer of 2020 near Breaks Interstate Park, Virginia. What happened during that stay still follows me in ways I can't fully describe. I'm Michael, 50 years old, and I teach mathematics at a community college in Roanoke. When the pandemic shut everything down and classes went remote, I decided to spend a few months in the mountains. One rented a small house near the park, right on the Kentucky-Virginia border, thinking I could teach my online classes and get some hiking in. The house came with access to a private trail system that connected to the park's main trails. The previous owner had been an avid hiker and had cut several paths through the forest behind the property. According to the rental listing, the trails were well marked and safe. I started hiking them in my first week there. The trails were indeed well marked, but in an unusual way. Instead of the standard colored blazes you see on most trails, these were marked with numbers. Simple white numerals painted on trees, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. One number per tree, following the path. At first I thought it was a quirky system, maybe a way for the previous owner to track distance or measure the trail somehow. The numbers increased sequentially as I walked, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. After about 20 trees, I reached a junction where the trail split. The left fork continued with 21, 22, 23. The right fork jumped to 100, 101, 10. Curious. I followed the right fork. The hundreds continued climbing. 103, 104, 105. After another few hundred yards, the trail split again. One branch continued with 200s. The other jumped to the 500s. I followed the 500s. The numbers kept increasing. 501, 502, 503. I hiked for almost an hour, watching the numbers climb into the 800s. The trail was getting fainter now, less maintained, but still marked with those white numerals every 50 feet or so. At 899, the trail ended abruptly. No junction, no continuation, just a final tree with 899 painted on it. Beyond that tree was thick forest with no path visible. I turned around and hiked back, following the numbers in reverse. 898, 897, 896, but something felt wrong. The numbers seemed to close together now, appearing every 20 feet instead of 50, and some of them looked different, the paint fresher, the numerals shaped slightly wrong. At 850, I found a tree I didn't remember passing on the way out. The number was painted in a different style, with a serif font instead of plain block letters. I kept walking, increasingly confused. The trail itself seemed familiar, but the spacing and style of the numbers kept changing. I finally made it back to the 100s, then the 20s, then single digits, and eventually back to my house. The hike back had taken 30 minutes longer than the hike out, though I'd been walking at the same pace. I marked it down to confusion and tiredness. The next day I tried a different trail branch, the one that had started with the 20s. These numbers climbed steadily, 21, 22, 23, all the way up to 67, where the trail ended at a small clearing. There was a fallen log there, rotted and covered with moss. On the log, someone had carved the number 67 deeply into the wood. The carving looked old, maybe decades old. I sat on the log and pulled out my lunch. As I ate, I noticed something strange. From where I sat, I could see 3 other numbered trees, 64, 65, and 66, but they were in the wrong order spatially. Tree 66 was to my left, 64 was straight ahead, and 65 was to my right. They didn't form a sequential line back down the trail the way they should have. I stood up and walked to tree 64. From that position, I could see tree 61, but also tree 69. Tree 69 was painted on a tree that wasn't on any trail I'd walked. I pushed through the undergrowth and found it, a white 69 on a hickory tree. From there, I could see 70, then 71. I followed these numbers deeper into the forest, off any established trail. The numbers led me in a winding path through increasingly dense vegetation. They weren't sequential anymore. I saw 71, then 74, then 72, then 76. The pattern made no sense, but they were clearly intentional, clearly leading somewhere. At number 84, I found another carved log. This one had 84 cut into it, but beneath that number was a message carved in smaller letters. Count backwards from here. I looked around. From this log, I could see several numbered trees in different directions. Following the instruction, I looked for 83. I found it behind me, back the way I'd come. But from 83, I couldn't see 82. I had to search, pushing through mountain laurel and briars. This went on for over an hour. The numbers jumped around: 83, 81, 79, 82, 78. I had to hunt for each one, sometimes backtracking, sometimes circling. As a mathematician, I kept trying to find the pattern, the logic behind the sequence, but there was none I could identify. The numbers seemed almost random, yet they clearly formed an intentional path. At number 43, I found another carved message: "You're counting wrong. Start over." Start over from where? From 43, from 1? I looked around in frustration. The forest was thick here, the canopy dense enough that even in midday it felt like dusk. I checked my phone. No signal, which was normal this deep in the mountains. But my GPS wasn't working either, just showing a blank screen with an error message. I decided to head back. But which way was back? I'd been following the numbers in such a convoluted path that I'd lost my sense of direction. I picked a direction that felt right and started walking. I found number 38 almost immediately, then 39, then 40. They were leading me somewhere, in sequence now. I followed them: 41, 42, 43, the one with the carved message, then 44, 45, 46. They continued up into the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. I was back in the high numbers now, climbing toward 899 perhaps, or beyond it. At 127, I stopped. This tree looked familiar. I was sure I'd seen it before, on my first hike, but that tree had been numbered 850-something, not 127. I examined the paint carefully. It was definitely 127, but I could see faint traces of other numbers beneath it, painted over multiple times. I scratched at the paint with my fingernail and revealed an 8 beneath the 1. This tree had been 827 at some point. Someone had repainted it. The sun was getting low. I needed to get back before dark. I abandoned the numbered trail and just walked downhill, knowing that would eventually lead to a creek, and creeks led to valleys, and valleys had roads. It took me 2 hours, but I finally reached a logging road I recognized. I followed it back to my rental house, arriving just after dark. I was exhausted, scratched up from pushing through undergrowth, and deeply unsettled by what I'd experienced. That night I made a diagram of all the numbers I'd seen and tried to find a mathematical pattern. Prime numbers, Fibonacci sequence, polynomial progression. Nothing fit. The sequence seemed deliberately chaotic. Over the next few days, I hiked the trails repeatedly, trying to map the entire number system. I took photos of every numbered tree I could find. I measured distances. I recorded GPS coordinates. I filled a notebook with observations and calculations. The numbers went up to at least 1,000 to 147. They also went below 1, into negative numbers, -5, -12, -23. They included decimals, 45.5, 67.3, 103.9. They included fractions, 88 and 1/4, 92 and 3/8. Some trees had multiple numbers, one painted above the other. Some had numbers that had been scratched out and replaced. I found carved messages on 7 different logs. Count backwards from here. You're counting wrong. Start over. This one comes before that one. Don't count the crossed out numbers. The sequence continues underground. Final number not yet determined. That last message, final number not yet determined, was carved on a log at the end of a trail that terminated at a sheer cliff face, overlooking the Russell Fork River, hundreds of feet below. The number on the tree nearest the cliff edge was 2048. I stood at that cliff edge for a long time, thinking about sequences and patterns and mathematical progressions. In my field, every sequence had a logic, a rule that governed it. Even seemingly random numbers followed statistical distributions, probability curves, underlying structures. But these numbers in the forest seemed to defy that. They were numbers divorced from meaning, from function, from purpose. Or maybe their purpose was something I couldn't understand. One evening, I was sitting on my porch when a man walked up the driveway. He was in his 70s, lean and weathered, carrying a small backpack. He introduced himself as Eugene, said he used to own the property I was renting. I asked him about the numbered trails. He smiled, a sad kind of smile, and sat down on the porch steps. "My son did that," he said. "Started when he was 12 years old. Just took some white paint and started numbering trees." I asked him why, but he said he couldn't explain it. Said the numbers needed to be there, in those specific places, in that specific order. He'd wake up in the middle of the night and go out with a flashlight to paint more numbers. Did that for 15 years. Eugene paused, looking out at the forest. "My son was a brilliant kid," he continued. "Had a scholarship to MIT, studying mathematics, but he never went. Couldn't leave the forest. Said the sequence wasn't complete yet. Said he was getting close to understanding what it meant, what it was counting toward. What happened to him?" I asked quietly. Eugene shook his head. "One morning I went looking for him. Found him at the cliff edge, where the 2000s end. He'd painted a new number on that last tree. Not 2048, something else. A number I'd never seen before, not in any mathematics I know. It had symbols mixed with digits, letters and numerals combined. And beneath that number, he'd carved one final message into the tree. I found it. The count is complete. And your son?" I asked. "Gone," Eugene said. "Never found him. Searched for weeks. His pack was there, his phone, his shoes, but he was gone." We sat in silence for a while. Then Eugene stood up and pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. He handed it to me. It was a photograph of the number his son had painted on that final tree. It looked like mathematics, but nothing I recognized. Symbols that resembled integrals and derivatives mixed with something. That might have been ancient numerals. "I keep thinking about what he meant," Eugene said. "I found it. The count is complete." What was he counting? What did he find? I couldn't answer him. I still can't. Eugene left a few minutes later, walking back down the driveway and disappearing into the forest. I never saw him again. I moved out of that rental 2 weeks early. I couldn't keep walking those trails, seeing those numbers, trying to find the pattern. The mathematician in me needed to solve it, to understand it. But the human in me was terrified of what would happen if I did. Because I keep thinking about Eugene's son. How he spent 15 years painting numbers in the forest. How he said he was getting close to understanding what they meant. And I think about that final message. The count is complete. What happens when you finish counting something? When you reach the end of a sequence? When the final number is determined? I don't know, and I'm afraid to find out. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about those numbers. I dream that I'm back in that forest, following the sequence, getting closer and closer to understanding. And in my dreams, I know that when I finally figure out what the numbers mean, when I finally count all the way to the end, something will happen. Something will be released, or summoned, or completed. Something that's been waiting a very long time for someone to finish the count. My parents owned this old cabin way out in the Appalachian foothills. My grandfather built it before paved roads even reached that area. If you wanted to find it, you have to follow a dirt track for what feels like forever, then hike another half-mile on foot. It's isolated in the purest sense. The cabin itself is basic. One room, creaky wooden floor, an old wood stove for heat, and a propane lantern for light. That's it. No electricity, no plumbing, and definitely cell service. It's the sort of place where you learn real quick how much noise your own breathing makes. When the world goes quiet, my parents mostly use it during hunting season, and the rest of the year it just sits out there collecting dust and probably raccoon footprints. I've been out there plenty of times, always with family or a couple of friends. But this time, I decided to go alone. I just finished one of those brutal stretches at school where you don't know what day it is anymore. 3 weeks of no real sleep, mainland ink off, and submitting papers at 3 a.m. My brain was fried. I didn't want to see another screen or hear another notification. I just wanted silence, and cabin is perfect for that. Friday afternoon, I parked at the end of the track. Can't drive the whole way unless you have a death wish for your car suspension. Slung my pack over my shoulder and hiked in. It was one of those hikes where you realize how much crap you packed about 5 minutes in. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, this wave of calm hit me. Like stepping off the grid in the truest sense. The first night was perfect. Lit a fire, cooked something simple, basically a can of chili dumped in a pot, and read by lantern until my eyes felt like sandpaper. Around midnight, I looked up, deadbolt on the door, checked the windows twice. That's a habit other. When you're surrounded by a 100 miles of dark forest, you double-check everything. Then I crashed into the old bed that's been there longer than I've been alive. The next morning, something was wrong. It wasn't a sound or a smell, just this feeling that snagged at me the second I opened my eyes. Took me a second to spot it. The door was unlocked. Now, I know I locked that door. Not just locked, deadbolted. I remember testing the knob before I went to bed. Out here, you don't half-ass it. But sure enough, the bolt was thrown back. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I was tired and forgot. Maybe I didn't turn it all the way. That made sense, right? Still, that thought sat in my head all day like a rockin' mishu. By evening, I told myself to drop it. Cooked, cleaned up, and sat on the little porch for a while. It's so quiet out there, it messes with your head. Every squirrel sounds like a bear. Every twig snap feels personal. And when the sun goes down, it doesn't fade like in city. It just drops. Suddenly, the world is black. Around 11 o'clock, I was inside, rocking gently in this old chair by the stove. Half dozing when I heard it. Something stepped onto the porch. Not light steps, heavy, slow. Each board let out this long aching groan like it didn't want to hold the weight. I froze. My eyes went straight to the door. The boards creaked again, then silence. I didn't even breathe. My heart was doing that loud thutching thing that makes you feel like it's in your throat. I waited 10 seconds, 20, maybe a full minute. Nothing. Finally, I reached for the rifle in the corner, trying not to make a sound, and crept to the window. The glass is old and wavy, so everything looks distorted. The yard was just shapes and shadows. It told myself it was a deer or a bear. That made sense, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I locked the door again, checked it twice, and shoved a chair under the handle. Sleep, forget it. Every creak of the cabin felt amplified. Every pop from the stove sounded like footsteps. Around 3 a.m., my eyes snapped open again, and something felt off. Took me a second to realize why. Light. There was this pale glow sliding across the far wall. Not firelight, not my lantern. It was coming from outside. I sat up slowly, throat dry, and moved to the window. There was something in the yard. At first, I thought my brain was short-circuiting from exhaustion. But then it moved. A figure tall, wrongly tall, thin in this broken, almost fragile way. Like a scarecrow someone had stretched. It was just standing there, head tilted back like it was sniffing the air. Its skin, or whatever it had, looked gray under the moon, samatone as the trees. Then it turned, not fast, just this slow, jerky motion. Like its joints didn't fit right until it was facing me, facing the cabin. The moon hit its eyes, then to pale glints, metallic. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My fingers dug into the wood of the window frame so hard they hurt. It didn't walk like a person. It kind of slid forward like its legs weren't bending right. I yanked the rifle up, hands trembling so bad I could barely keep it level, and aimed at the window. But it didn't come closer. It just stood there watching. Then without a sound, it turned and slipped back into the trees like it was never there. I sat there until dawn, rifle in my lap, staring at that window. Every sound outside felt like a count. When daylight finale came, I stepped outside. My stomach dropped the second I saw the ground tracks, not human, not any animal I've seen. For long toes, each ending in ablant claw. The prints were deep. Whatever made them was heavy, and they circled the cabin twice. I wanted to leave right then, but the thought of walking that half-mile through dense woods, knowing that thing was out there, my legs wouldn't move. So I stayed all day, rifle across my lap, eyes flicking from the door to the windows. The forest was dead quiet. No birds, no bugs, just nothing. When the sun started to drop again, I felt my stomach knot. I knew it would come back. It did. Just after midnight, the boards groaned under something heavy. Slow steps across the porch, then tap on the window. I didn't move, didn't blink. Another tap, then a long scraping sound along the wall, like claws dragging against the wood. And then the voice low, guttural, like some Ioni trying to speak through a throat full of gravel. At first, it was just noise, wrong. But the longer it went on, the more it started shaping into something. My name, I don't know how it knew. It circled Thekabin for hours, tapping, scraping, saying my name like it was practicing at some point. I must have blacked out from exhaustion, because when I opened my eyes again, sunlight was streaming through the window. I stepped outside and my blood ran cold. More tracks, dozens of them, not just around the cabin, on the porch, right up to the door, and carved into the dirt wear lines, shapes, symbols maybe. I didn't look long enough to figure them out. It grabbed my pack and ran. Didn't stop until I saw my car. I don't know what the thing was or how it knew my name, but I know one thing. I'm never going back to that cabin again. In the early days of the fall of 2017, I was spending some time near Pound, Virginia. I didn't expect anything unusual, but I was wrong. My name is Angela. I'm 45 years old, and I work as a respiratory therapist at a hospital in Bristol. I'd been under a lot of stress at work, and my doctor suggested I take some time off. My aunt owned a small house in Pound, in Wise County, and she offered to let me stay there for a month while she was traveling. Pound is a small coal mining town tucked into a narrow valley. The house sat on the side of a ridge, overlooking the town below. It was isolated, but comfortable, with a long porch that faced east toward Pine Mountain. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, but an absence of sound quiet that felt oppressive. Even the wind seemed muted. Birds were scarce. I chalked it up to the season or the location. On my third night there, I woke up at 2 a.m. to a sound I knew intimately from my work: breathing. Slow, deep, rhythmic breathing. The kind of breathing you hear on a ventilator, mechanically precise. It was coming from outside. I got up and went to the window. The sound was louder there, clearly coming from somewhere on the ridge. I opened the window and the sound became overwhelming. It wasn't just breathing. It was the breathing of something massive, something with lungs far larger than any human or animal. Each inhalation lasted roughly 8 seconds, followed by an 8-second exhalation. The rhythm never varied. I told myself it was wind moving through a cave or a geological vent, some natural formation that created an acoustic illusion. But as a respiratory therapist, I'd spent my entire career listening to breathing patterns, and this was definitely breathing. There was a wet quality to it, the subtle sound of moisture in airways, the slight whistle of air moving through a restricted passage. The sound continued all night. When dawn came, it gradually faded, becoming quieter until by sunrise it was gone completely. I didn't sleep well after that. The next night, I waited for the sound. It started again at exactly 2 a.m. Same rhythm, same deep, mechanical breathing. I timed it with my watch. 8 seconds in, 8 seconds out, no variation. I recorded it on my phone, thinking I could analyze it later or show it to someone who might explain it. The recording was useless. When I played it back, all I heard was static and what might have been wind. The breathing didn't register. I decided to investigate in daylight. I hiked up the ridge behind the house, looking for caves or vents or any geological feature that might explain the sound. The ridge was heavily wooded, mostly pine and oak, with thick undergrowth. I found nothing unusual. No caves, no vents, no openings in the rock face. But I did find something else. Trees with damaged bark, not from animals or weather, but from pressure. It looked like something had pressed against them with tremendous force, hard enough to crack the bark and leave impressions. The impressions were large, roughly circular, maybe 4 feet in diameter, and they were at varying heights, some at ground level, some 10 feet up the trunk. I touched one of the impressions. The wood beneath the bark was still slightly warm. That night the breathing started again at 2 a.m. But this time it was different. The rhythm had changed. Instead of 8 seconds, each breath was now 6 seconds. And the sound was closer, much closer. It seemed to be coming from directly behind the house, maybe 50 feet away. I looked out the window but saw nothing. Just the dark outline of trees against the night sky. But the breathing continued, steady and loud and impossibly real. Then I heard something else. Between the breaths, during the brief pause between exhalation and inhalation, there was a faint crackling sound, like the sound of cartilage moving, or ribs expanding and contracting. As a respiratory therapist, I'd heard that sound before. In patients with severe lung disease, when the lung tissue becomes stiff and damaged, breathing produces audible crackles and pops. Medical professionals call them rails. They indicate serious pathology, fluid in the lungs or scarred tissue. Whatever was breathing out there had damaged lungs. I called my aunt the next morning. I asked her if she'd ever heard anything strange at night while staying at the house. She was quiet for a moment before answering. "You hear it too," she said. "It's why I don't stay there anymore." "What is it?" I asked. She sighed. "The old folks in Pound call it the ridge breather. Been there longer than the town. Some say it's the mountain itself breathing, that there's something deep underground, some kind of organism or geological process that causes it. Others say it's a spirit, something left over from the mining days. Men died in those mines, Angela. Lots of men. Bad air, cave-ins, explosions. They say some of them are still down there, still trying to breathe." "That's just folklore," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe," my aunt replied. "But I'll tell you what I know for sure. Every time someone dies in Pound, the breathing gets louder, and the rhythm changes, gets faster, more labored. Like whatever it is, it's getting sicker." I thanked her and hung up. I spent the rest of the day researching mining deaths in Wise County. The list was extensive. Explosions, collapses, black lung disease, hundreds of men over the decades. The most recent death was in 2016. A retired miner named Carl Hendricks, who died from pneumoconiosis, coal worker's lung. That was a year before I arrived. That night I waited for the breathing. It started at 2 a.m., and this time I was ready. I'd brought home a portable pulse oximeter and a stethoscope from the hospital. If this was breathing, I was going to measure it. I went outside and followed the sound. It led me up the ridge, into the dark forest. The breathing got louder as I climbed, until it was deafening, each exhalation like a gale wind. I could feel the force of it, warm and moist, carrying a smell I recognized immediately, the smell of infection, of necrotic tissue, of lungs breaking down. I found the source about 100 yards up the ridge. It was a depression in the earth, roughly circular, maybe 20 feet across. The breathing was coming from there, from deep underground. With each exhalation, I could see the ground itself move, rising and falling in rhythm with the breaths. I knelt at the edge of the depression and pressed my stethoscope against the ground. What I heard made my blood run cold. It wasn't just breathing. It was the sound of failing lungs, of airways filled with fluid, of tissue so damaged it barely functioned. Medically, I would call it agonal breathing, the kind of breathing a person does in their final moments, when the body is shutting down, but still fighting for one more breath. Whatever was down there was dying, had been dying for a long time, and it was enormous. I stayed there for over an hour, timing the breaths, counting the respiratory rate, noting the quality of each breath. The pattern was consistent with end-stage respiratory failure. If this were a patient, I would say they had hours, maybe days left. But this had been breathing for decades, according to my aunt, maybe centuries, according to the folklore. How could something be in end-stage respiratory failure for that long? Unless it couldn't die, unless it was trapped in that moment, forever suffocating, forever failing, forever fighting for one more breath. I went back to the house and packed my things. I left Pound the next morning and didn't tell my aunt exactly why. I just said the house wasn't helping me relax the way I'd hoped. But I've thought about it every day since. I've thought about that rhythm, 6 seconds in, 6 seconds out. I've thought about the smell of infection, the sound of failing lungs, and I've thought about all those miners, all those men who died gasping for air in collapsed tunnels and poisoned shafts. 3 months after I left Pound, I got a call from my aunt. Another miner had died, she told me. Lung cancer this time, a man named Douglas Parks who'd worked the mines for 30 years. She said the night he died, people all over Pound heard the breathing. It was louder than anyone could remember, faster, more desperate. Some people said it sounded like screaming. I asked her if it had stopped. No, she said. But it's different now. The rhythm changed again. It's faster, more labored. Like whatever it is, it's getting worse. I haven't been back to Pound. I don't plan to go back. But sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear it. That deep, rhythmic breathing. 6 seconds in, 6 seconds out. The sound of something massive and damaged, trapped beneath the earth, slowly suffocating. And I wonder how many more deaths it will take before it finally stops breathing. Or if it will ever stop at all. I'd been on that trail before, but never this far out and never in winter. Feckled changes everything out there. The trees were stripped bare, their branches clawing at the gray sky. The ground had that soft, spongy feel from months of frotting leaves. I started out at 10, thinking I'd hit the overlook, maybe eat a sandwich, and make it back before the sun dipped. 12 miles round trip, 6 up, 6 down. Doable. I'd done harder. About 2 hours in, I noticed the quiet. Not just quieter, silent. The kind of silence that doesn't announce itself. It just happens. 1 minute there's background noise. The tap of a woodpecker, a squirrel kicking leaves, branches creaking in the wind. Then nothing. Like someone shut off the sound in the whole world. It didn't hit me right away. I kept walking for a while before it clicked. Then I stopped. Just stood there with my breath fogging the air, listening. No birds, no wind. Not even the distant groan of trees shifting. Just my boots grinding the frozen dirt and my heartbeat, which suddenly felt way too loud. I told myself it wasn't weird. Animals hide in the cold, right? Birds shinker down, deer stay still, the forest gets quiet. Sure, but the way it happened, so sharp. Like someone flicked a switch, felt off. It didn't fade gradually, it stopped. The trail tightened as it climbed a longer rock face. One of those sections where you really pay attention, because one bad step means you're sliding a good 30 feet down into a mess of boulders. On my lift, the stone wall was slick with ice, glistening like glass. On the right, Fedrop waited. If you're not great with heights, it's the kind of view that makes your stomach roll if you look too long. So I kept my eyes on the ground, counting steps in my head like some kid walking on a balance beam. That's when I saw something dark against the pale ground ahead. At first, I thought it was a scrap of fabric. People lose things out here all the time. Gloves, hats, random trash. But when I got closer, I saw it wasn't fabric. It was hair. A clump of it, black and coarse, matted with something that looked too dark to be mud. Thick strands stuck together like they'd been ripped out, not shed. I squatted down without touching it, just stared. And something about the side of it, just hair. That's all it was, made my stomach knot. It wasn't just the size of the clump. It was the way it lay there, like I didn't belong. Too much for a squirrel, wrong texture for a deer, and definitely not bear. My first thought was a dog, maybe someone's hunting hound. But there was no blood, no paw prints, nothing. I should have turned around right then. Everything in me knew that. But I didn't. I just kept walking because apparently I have the survival instincts of a wet sock. Another half mile, and I saw something else palely against the dark leaves leaning against a fallen log. From a distance, I thought it was a stick, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't wood. It was a bone. Long, smooth, and wrong. Too thin for a deer leg, too clean to be random debris. The ends weren't sharp either. They were worn down, noted to a slick, polished shine. And then I saw the footprints. They were off the trail in a patch off soil that hadn't frozen yet. Big enough to be human, but barefoot and not right. The toes curled inward, sharp and hooked like claws. The arches were weird, too high. Like whoever left them didn't walk like we do. That's when the little voice in my head went from, how weird, to get the hell out of here. And for a second, I almost did. I almost turned around. But, and this makes no sense, the thought of going back down the trail felt worse than going forward. It was like the silence had weight pressing me toward the overlooked dot, like if I turned my back, something would follow. The trail ended at the ridge. No more path, just a sheer drapindo miles of layered hills stretching out like a gray-green ocean under a flat ski. I should have felt relieved when I reached the end. Instead, I felt exposed, like standing in a wide-open field during a lightning storm. That's when I heard it behind me. Not footsteps, a dragging sound, something sliding through the leaves, a long pull, then a pause, then again closer. This time I turned. It was standing at the tree line. At first my brain tried to fight under man. It was crouched low, arms hanging down so far they almost touched the ground. But then it shifted and my stomach dropped, because nothing about that shape was right. Too thin, too long. Its skin looked wrong. Not pale exactly, just off. Like stretch-ed leather left out in the rain. Like paper soaked and dried too fast. And the head, Jesus, the head didn't belong to that body. Too big, too heavy. Hanging forward like the neck couldn't handle the weight. It didn't move fast. Just stood there, the spine bending in thesis low. Horrible arcs like it had extra joints, and the sound. God, that sound, a clicking noise over and over, like teeth chattering with no lips to hidethum. I started backing toward the cliff without thinking. Every nerve in my body screamed, run. But my legs felt locked. My breath came short and sharp, like I'd been punched. The thing tilted its head slow and curious, like it was trying to see inside me. Then it dropped flat so fast it looked like gravity just slammed it down. And it started crawling. Not like a person, not like an animal. Its arms and legs bent the wrong way, joints snapping loud enough for me to hear. That clicking didn't stop. That broke me. I ran. I didn't remember the first 100 yards. Just trees whipping past, boots slipping on ice and leaves. Every time I stumbled, I felt it behind me, close enough to grab my legs. I never heard normal footsteps. Just that dragging scrape and the click, 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 getting faster, sharper. I lost the trail twice, crashed through brush, ripped my hands open on rocks, and still I ran. My lungs burned so body tasted blood. My vision tunneled. Every shadow felt alive. But I didn't stop until I saw the glint of my truck through the trees. I hit the door so hard it bounced back at me. Dove inside, slammed it shut, and jammed the key into the ignition with hands that didn't feel like mine. When the engine roared, it heard one last click. Close, to damn close. I didn't look back. I threw the truck in gear, tore down the dirt road so fast the wheel jerked under my grip, and I didn't care. I haven't gone back to that ridge. During my stay near Coburn, Virginia in the fall of 2016, something happened that I still can't fully make sense of. I'm Richard, 58 years old, and I'm a technical writer for a software company. I can work from anywhere with decent internet. So when my lease ended in Richmond, I decided to spend 6 months in the mountains. I found a rental cabin outside Coburn, in Wise County, advertised as private and peaceful with reliable Wi-Fi. The cabin was perfect. Small, clean, well-maintained, with a good desk for my work and a reliable internet connection. The only odd thing was the trail behind the cabin. According to the property owner, a man named Jack who lived in town, the trail was private and led nowhere important. Don't worry about it, he said when I asked. Just an old logging road. Doesn't go anywhere useful. But the trail was too well-maintained to be abandoned. The path was clear, the vegetation trimmed back, and there were fresh boot prints in the dirt. Someone used this trail regularly. I ignored it for the first 2 weeks. I focused on my work, settling into a routine. But I'm a curious person by nature, and that trail bothered me. Where did it go? Who maintained it? Why did Jack discourage me from using it? On a Saturday morning, I decided to hike it. The trail started behind the cabin and headed uphill into dense forest. It was well marked, not with blazes, but with small cairns every 100 feet or so. Stacks of 3 or 4 stones placed deliberately. I followed the trail for about half a mile. It was a steady uphill climb, nothing difficult, winding between oak and pine trees. The cairns continued regularly, marking the way. Then the trail did something strange. It split into 3 paths, but they weren't just random forks. Each path had a sign, wooden posts with carved arrows and single words, taught, untaught. Half-taught. I stood at the junction for a long time, trying to make sense of it. What did those words mean? Taught what? By whom? I chose the taught path, figuring it was the most established route. This trail was even better maintained than the main trail, almost manicured. The cairns were larger here, more carefully constructed, and every 200 feet or so, there were benches made from split logs, places to rest. On the first bench, I found a small wooden box. Inside was a notebook and a pencil. The notebook was filled with entries, dozens of them, dating back years. The handwriting varied, different people making notes. I flipped through it randomly. July 2011. Completed the taught path today. Took 3 hours. Understanding is clearer now. March 2013. Third time through. Each time reveals more. The sequence is logical. September 2014. Brought my daughter. She couldn't finish. Maybe next year. October 2015. The taught path teaches what it needs to teach. I'm grateful. The entries were cryptic but consistent. Everyone mentioned understanding something, learning something, completing something. But what? I put the notebook back and continued hiking. The trail climbed steadily, curving around the ridge. At the second bench, there was another box with another notebook. This one had fewer entries, but similar themes. The taught path requires patience. One entry read, "Don't rush what needs to be learned." At the third bench, the notebook contained a warning. If you feel lost, you're not ready. Turn back. I didn't feel lost. The trail was clear, the cairns obvious. One kept going. The fourth bench had a notebook with only one entry recent, dated just 2 weeks earlier. Some people never finish. They walk this trail forever and never reach the end. That made me uneasy, but I pressed on. The trail began to level out, following the ridge line now instead of climbing. The forest was dense here, the canopy thick enough to block most sunlight. It felt later in the day than it actually was. At the fifth bench, I checked my watch. I'd been hiking for 90 minutes. At my pace, I should be at least 3 miles from the cabin. But when I checked my phone's GPS, it showed I'd traveled less than a mile. That couldn't be right. I looked back down the trail. I could see the fourth bench from here, maybe 100 feet away. And beyond that, the third bench was visible. And the second. They were all in sight, strung out along the ridge in a line. But I'd walked much farther than that. I was sure of it. I continued forward. The sixth bench appeared after what felt like another 20 minutes of hiking. This notebook contained a single question, written in capitals. Do you understand what you're being taught? I sat down on the bench and thought about it. What was I being taught? I'd been walking a trail, reading notebooks, observing cairns. I'd learned nothing except that other people had walked the same path and written cryptic messages about understanding and completion. Unless that was the lesson, unless the trail itself was teaching something through the act of walking it. I stood up and looked ahead. The trail continued, curving out of sight. I looked back. All the previous benches were still visible, impossibly close together despite the time I'd spent walking between them. That's when I realized the truth. The trail wasn't measuring distance. It was measuring something else. Time, maybe, or effort, or understanding. I decided to continue. I wanted to reach the end, to complete the taught path, to learn whatever it was supposed to teach me. The seventh bench had no notebook, just a carved message in the seat. You're halfway there. The real teaching begins now. After the seventh bench, the trail changed. The cairns were gone. The path itself became less distinct, more overgrown. I had to pay careful attention to stay en route. Several times I lost the trail completely and had to backtrack to find it again. This continued for what felt like hours. The forest grew darker, the trees closer together. My phone was useless, GPS still showing impossible data, and the battery draining faster than it should. I found bench 8 purely by accident, nearly sitting on it before I realized it was there. It was hidden in underbrush, barely visible. The notebook was water damaged, most entries illegible. But I could make out one phrase, "The taught path teaches through struggle." I was tired now, genuinely exhausted. I'd been hiking for what felt like 5 or 6 hours, though my watch showed only 3 hours had passed. My legs ached. I was thirsty, and I'd foolishly brought no water. The ninth bench appeared at the bottom of a steep descent. Getting to it required careful climbing down a rocky slope. The notebook here contained recent entries, all from the same person, dated over several days. Day 1, I'm staying at the 9th bench. Can't go forward. Can't go back. The trail taught me something I wasn't ready to learn. Day 2, still here. Food running out. The taught path doesn't let you leave until you understand. Day 3, I think I understand now. The trail teaches that some paths can't be walked partway. You finish or you stay. Day 4, I'm going to try again. If I don't complete it this time, I don't know what will happen. There were no more entries. I sat on that bench for a long time, trying to decide what to do. Push forward to the end, wherever that was, or turn back, admit defeat, accept that I wasn't ready for whatever the taught path was teaching. I chose to go back. I stood up and started retracing my steps, climbing back up that rocky slope, pushing through the overgrown sections, looking for the trail I'd followed here. But the trail wouldn't let me go back. Every path I took led forward, not backward. I tried multiple times, taking different routes, but they all curved around and deposited me back at the 9th bench. I was trapped. The taught path didn't allow retreat. As the sun began to set, I realized I had no choice but to continue forward. I walked for another hour in growing darkness, the trail barely visible. Twice I fell, scraping my hands and knees. My phone battery died. I was alone in the forest, following a path I could barely see, learning a lesson I didn't understand. The 10th bench appeared in near total darkness. I felt my way to it and sat down, exhausted and frightened. There was no notebook here, just another carved message. The taught path ends when you understand. Not before. I sat there in the dark, trying to understand. What was this trail teaching me? What was I supposed to learn? And then it came to me. The trail was teaching patience. It was teaching humility. It was teaching that some knowledge can't be rushed, that some understanding requires struggle and time and willingness to be uncomfortable. The trail was teaching me that I didn't control my own learning, that the path itself decided when I was ready. As soon as I had that thought, the trail changed. I felt it more than saw it. The darkness seemed to lift slightly. Ahead of me, I could see lights. Not electric lights, but something else. Reflective markers perhaps, catching moonlight. I stood up and walked forward. The trail was clear now, obvious and easy. The markers led me downhill, back towards civilization. Within 30 minutes, I emerged from the forest behind my rental cabin. I checked my watch. It was 10 p.m. I'd been on the trail for 12 hours. Jack, the property owner, called me the next morning. He asked if I'd hike the trail behind the cabin. I asked him how he knew. He said people who stay at the cabin always eventually hike that trail. And he always knows when they do because they come back different. Different how? I asked. Quieter, he said. More patient, like they learned something they needed to learn. I asked him what the untaught and half-taught paths led to. He was quiet for a moment before answering. The untaught path doesn't teach anything, he said. It just loops forever. People get lost on it for days. And the half-taught path is worse. It teaches you just enough to make you dangerous, to make you think you understand something you don't. People who walk that path come back wrong. Wrong how? Confused, he said. Unstable. They think they learned the lesson, but they only got part of it. They spend the rest of their lives trying to figure out what they missed. I thanked him and hung up. I've never hiked that trail again. I finished my 6 months in that cabin and moved on with my life. But sometimes I think about those other paths, the untaught and the half-taught. I think about the people who chose differently than I did, who walked different trails and learned different lessons, or no lessons at all. And I wonder if I really completed the taught path, or if I just thought I did. I wonder if the lesson I learned was the real lesson, or if it was only part of it. I wonder if I'm one of those people who came back wrong, thinking I understand something I don't. Because here's what bothers me most. Since walking that trail, I've lost my ability to take shortcuts. In my work, in my life, in everything I do, I have to complete every task fully, follow every process through to its end, learn every lesson completely. I can't stop partway anymore. I can't skim or rush or take the easy way. It's like the trail taught me to well, like it took away my ability to quit, my ability to say when enough is enough. And sometimes I worry that the taught path isn't finished with me yet, that it's still teaching me, that maybe it will never stop. My uncle had this old hunting cabin buried so deep in the Appalachian. It might as well have been on another planet. No GPS, no cell signal, just 3 hours from the nearest town to from closest gas station, and surrounded by a forest that feels older than time. When I called him to ask if I could stay for the weekend, he hesitated. Not long, but enough for me to notice. Then he said, "Sure, don't expect much. It's raw out there." His voice had this tone, like he wanted to add something else, but didn't. I laughed and asked, "Anything I should know?" "Yeah," he said. His voice went flat. "Keep the generator off at night. It leaks fuel sometimes." I joked back, "Got it. No explosions. Anything else?" It was his pause long enough that I thought the line dropped. Then, "Don't wander after dark. You'll get turned around out there." That was it. No explanation, no story, just that dead flat warning that stuck with me the whole drive up. The road felt endless, switchbacks curling up the mountains like some kind of snake, ridges black against a sky that couldn't make up its mind about nightfall. By the time I hit the dirt track leading in, the sun was gone. The truck clattered over puddles and loose gravel, trees leaning in so close my headlights bounced shadows across the windshield. At some point, it stopped, feeling like a road and more like a tunnel carved out of the woods. The cabin was smaller than I remembered. Just a sagging box with a porch that looked like it was trying to slide off one side. The steps groaned when I walked up, and when I opened the door, it hit me. The smell of old pine dust and something faintly metallic, like old nails in a damp toolbox. Inside was simple. One bedroom, a kitchen with a hand pump, a living room with a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't seen a flame in decades. Silence filled the space, so heavy it almost had weight. I dumped my bag, made a quick meal on the propane stove, and sat on the porch until the light was gone. Out there, darkness doesn't creep in slow. It just slams down. 1 second, the ridges were silhouettes. The next they were gone, replaced by black that swallowed everything. I locked the door, killed the lamps, and spread my sleeping bag on the couch. For a while, I just stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of my own ears because that's how quiet it was. Sleep didn't stick. I drift, then snap awake, my heart running like it heard something before I did. Could have been nerves, could have been the old wood popping. I told myself that every time until I heard the scrape. It wasn't loud, just enough to pull me out of half sleep. A slow drag like something sliding against the wall outside. I froze, every muscle locked. My brain ran through excuses. Tree branch, wind, raccoon, anything that made sense. The forest can make weird noises. I almost believed it until it came again. Longer this time. Scrape, pause, scrape not random. Like someone tracing their finger. Slow, deliberate. I slipped out of the sleeping bag, bare feet hitting cold planks. The hatchet I'd used earlier leaned against the wall. My hand went to it without thinking, like my body decided before my brain caught up. I stood there, gripping it so tight McKnuckles HAD, staring at the door. Then it came again, closer this time, right by the kitchen window. And with it, this sound I wish I could unhear. A breath long, wet, drawn slow against the wood like something savoring the feel of it. Every instinct screamed one thing. Stay silent. I crept toward the kitchen, floorboards sighing under my feet, every creak like a gunshot in the quiet. My fingers found the edge of the curtain. I peeled it back a sliver, enough to see nothing, just black on black. My own pale face in the glass. Beyond that, shadows lay radiant shadows, the kind your eyes want to turn into shapes. And yet, I swear something shifted. Not a full figure, just the sense of something moving. Like if night itself took a step closer. The scraping stopped. Silence dropped salvy, it almost rang. Then footsteps, slow, heavy, circling the cabin. I backed away, trying to keep my breathing small. Hatchet raised. The steps faded, soft at first, then gone. A minute passed. 2, 5. Nothing but the old wood groaning like it was holding its breath. I didn't even try to sleep after that. I sat on the floor, back against the couch, hatchet across my knees, eyes on that door, until the first smear off gray touched the windows. When the light was strong enough to see, I finally stepped outside. The yard was slick with dew. The air sharpened my lungs. That's when I saw them. Tracks, not boots, not paws. A straight line from the porcindo the trees, each one deep enough to hold water, split into like hooked blades gouged the earth. I followed them because God helped me. I had to know. They went 30, maybe 40 yards, weaving between pines and undergrowth. And then nothing. The trail just ended. No leaves disturbed, no branches snapped. Just an abrupt stop in the middle of nowhere. Like whatever made them walk it out of existence that broke something in me. I spun, ran back, packed fast enoughy, barely remembered zipping the bag and slammed it into the truck bed. When Thinjin roared, it sounded almost alive, like it wanted to help me get out. Tharrowed back was a blur of gravel and curves. I told myself I was fine. I told myself it was over. I clung to the tunnel the last bend before the highway when I saw it. It was there at the tree line, crouched low, watching me go. Its skin was pale, stretched so thin over bones that jutted wrong, like it was built from a blueprint someone crumpled up and tried to smooth back out. Its arms were too long, hands dragging furrows in the dirt like ropes of wet sinew. And its head, God, that head tilted slow as I flew past, jaw opening wider and wider until I swore the whole thing would split in two. I didn't stop, didn't look back. Back in the autumn of 2019, I found myself spending some time near Robbinsville, North Carolina. I didn't expect that week to turn strange so quickly. My name is Catherine, and I'm 39 years old. I work as an architectural historian, specializing in early American construction techniques. The Graham County Historical Society had hired me to document a series of stone chimneys built by Scottish settlers in the 1780s. These chimneys were remarkable for their craftsmanship and had somehow survived when the cabins around them had long since rotted away. I was staying in a small rental house on the edge of the Nantahala National Forest, about 20 minutes from the nearest town. That the house itself was unremarkable. Built sometime in the 1960s, it had that typical ranch style you see all over rural America. The landlord was a quiet man named Vernon who lived further down the mountain. He gave me the key and told me the water pressure was weak and the furnace made noise, but everything worked fine. He didn't mention anything else. The first 3 days went smoothly. I spent my mornings photographing the chimney sites, taking measurements, and making detailed sketches. The work was solitary but satisfying. Each chimney told a story about the people who built it, the tools they used, the stone they selected from nearby creek beds. In the evenings, I would return to the rental house, make dinner, and type up my notes. It was on the 4th night that I first heard the voices. I had just finished washing my dinner dishes when I noticed a faint sound coming from the living room. At first, I thought the television had somehow turned itself on, but when I walked in, the screen was dark. The sound was coming from the fireplace. It was a brick fireplace, probably original to the house, with a simple wooden mantel. I hadn't used it since arriving, because the weather was still mild. I knelt down and listened. The sound was definitely voices, multiple voices, speaking in low tones that rose and fell in a rhythm that sounded almost like conversation. I couldn't make out any words, just the cadence of speech. The strange part was that the voices sounded distant, as if they were coming from far up inside the chimney itself. I told myself it must be some acoustic phenomenon, maybe wind moving through the flue in a particular way, or perhaps sound carrying from somewhere else in the valley. I closed the fireplace damper and went to bed. The voices continued the next night. This time they were louder, more distinct. I still couldn't understand the words, but I could tell there were at least 3 different speakers. One voice was higher pitched, possibly a woman. The others were deeper, masculine. They seemed to be having an urgent discussion about something. The tone wasn't angry exactly, but there was an intensity to it that made me uncomfortable. I opened the damper and shined my flashlight up into the chimney. The beam illuminated rough brick walls rising into darkness. I saw nothing unusual. No birds, no debris, no obvious source for the sounds. But as soon as I clicked off the flashlight, the voices resumed. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about those voices, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Around 2 in the morning, I got up to use the bathroom. As I passed through the living room, I noticed the fireplace was glowing faintly, not with fire, but with a pale amber light that seemed to be emanating from deep within the chimney. The voices were clearer now, and for the first time, I thought I caught a few words. Find it. One voice said, "It's still there." We looked. Another voice responded, "Nothing remains. It has to be there." The first voice insisted, "It has to be." I stood in the dark living room, my heart beating faster than it should. These were not acoustic tricks or wind patterns. These were actual human voices having an actual conversation somewhere inside my chimney. But that was impossible. The chimney was maybe 18 inches wide. No person could fit inside it. I turned on every light in the house and checked the locks on the doors. Everything was secure. I even went outside with a flashlight and looked at the chimney from the exterior. It rose about 4 feet above the roof line, capped with a simple metal cover. There was no way anyone could be up there. The next morning I called Vernon, the landlord. I tried to keep my tone casual, asking if he'd ever noticed anything strange about the fireplace. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "You hear something?" he finally asked. "Just some odd sounds," I said. "Like voices, maybe. Probably just acoustics. Don't use the fireplace," he said quickly. "And don't listen too close. Sometimes old chimneys carry things they shouldn't." "What does that mean?" I asked, but he had already hung up. That afternoon I did some research at the local library. I learned that the land where my rental house stood had once been part of a much larger property, owned by a family named Hutchins. In 1887, there had been a fire. The original farmhouse burned to the ground. 3 people died in that fire, trapped in an upstairs bedroom. Their bodies were recovered, but according to one brief newspaper account, there had been some confusion about the cause of death. The article mentioned smoke inhalation, but also referenced unexplained injuries. The article didn't say where exactly the old Hutchins house had stood, but given that my rental house was built in the 1960s and brick chimneys were commonly salvaged and reused, I started to wonder if the fireplace in my living room had come from that original structure. That night I tried to ignore the voices, but they were impossible to block out. They grew louder and more insistent. The conversation had changed. Now they seemed to be calling out, not to each other, but to someone else. Calling out to something outside the chimney. "Come down," one voice said. "Come down and help us find it. It's buried deep," another voice added. "Under the stones, under the old foundation. You can help us," the third voice said. "You can reach it." I realized with a chill that they were talking to me. I packed my things that night and checked into a motel in Robbinsville. I called Vernon the next morning and told him I was leaving early, that I'd completed my work ahead of schedule. He didn't argue. He just asked if the house had bothered me. "The chimney," I said. "The voices in the chimney." He sighed. "They've been there a long time. Some folks hear them, some don't. My wife heard them. That's why we don't live there anymore. She said they wanted something from her, something buried. We never could figure out what they meant. Did you ever try to find out?" I asked. Vernon was quiet for a moment. "We dug around the foundation once," he said. "Found some old bones, animal mostly. But there was other stuff too. Personal items, things that shouldn't have been buried there. We filled it back in and built the rental house on top. Thought that would be the end of it. Asterisk, but it wasn't." I said. "No, ma'am," he replied. "It wasn't. I finished my work in Graham County and returned home to Asheville. I wrote my report on the historic chimneys and submitted it to the Historical Society. I never mentioned what I'd heard in that rental house. What would I say? That I'd heard voices in a chimney asking me to dig up a foundation? But here's the thing that still bothers me, the thing that keeps me awake some nights. 3 weeks after I left Robbinsville, I was at home in my own house when I heard a faint sound coming from my bedroom. I followed it to the corner where an old brick chimney runs up through the interior wall. The house was built in 1923, and the chimney is original. I pressed my ear against the brick and listened. The voices were there, faint but unmistakable. The same voices I'd heard in Robbinsville, still having the same conversation, still searching for whatever was buried beneath those stones. "Come down," they whispered. "Come down and help us find it. I don't use that bedroom anymore. I sleep in the guest room on the other side of the house. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear them calling, and I wonder what would happen if I actually went back to that property in Robbinsville. and started digging. I wonder what I would find buried beneath the foundation. And I wonder if finding it would make the voices stop. Or if it would make something worse begin. This happened during the summer of 2014, a time that now feels almost like another lifetime, yet remains vivid in my memory. I grew up in southern Appalachia, nestled in the western part of North Carolina, about a half-hour's drive from Asheville. These mountains aren't just a place to me. They're in my blood. Their rolling hills, deep hollows, and dense forests are part of one of the oldest landscapes on Earth, with rock formations that date back over 1 billion years. With such ancient land comes a sense of mystery, an eerie blend of the haunting and the awe-inspiring that has shaped the folklore of the region. For generations, one of the most famous local phenomena is the Brown Mountain Lights, an occurrence I've witnessed countless times from wise men's view. But as strange as they are, they've never filled me with fear or left me feeling unsettled. They simply exist, just as I do. And over the years, I suppose I've learned to accept the unknown as just another part of life in these mountains. If you respect them, they respect you back. That was always my family's motto, and I took pride in it. My girlfriend at the time was from St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada. We had met during university, and that year decided it would be a great idea to take a road trip together. Initially, our plan was to head up to Canada so she could visit her family. But around the same time, my grandmother, whom I hadn't seen in almost 2 years, fell ill. The doctors assured us it was nothing serious, just a bad case of the flu. But since it had been so long since I'd last visited her, we figured it would be worth taking a detour. That way we could check in on her while also turning the journey into a proper road trip. From where we were starting, the drive to my grandmother's house was long, somewhere between 20 to 24 hours if we were to go non-stop. But of course, we had no intention of driving straight through without breaks. Instead, we mapped out multiple stops along the way to make the journey more enjoyable and less exhausting. Even though my girlfriend wasn't particularly used to the discomfort of sleeping in a van, the first leg of our trip was nothing short of incredible. She was completely in awe of the landscapes we passed, marveling at the rolling hills, the endless forests, and the changing colors of the sky as we moved through different regions. I, on the other hand, was just happy to see her reaction, knowing that I was finally able to share with her a piece of the world that meant so much to me. We made a stop in Buffalo to grab something to eat and restock on supplies, before continuing down to Pittsburgh, where we were lucky enough to catch a breathtaking sunset that painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. But it was once we crossed into West Virginia that the true sense of wilderness and isolation began to settle in. The roads stretched on endlessly, weaving through dense, shadowed forests with only the occasional small town breaking up the miles of unspoiled nature. After several hours of driving through this near, empty landscape, my girl glanced at the dashboard and pointed out that we were running low on gas. We pulled up the map to find the nearest station, which turned out to be a fairly remote spot, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. By the time we finally arrived, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving us surrounded by thick darkness, save for the dim glow of the station's flickering overhead lights. As we pulled in, my girlfriend made a joke about how places like this were straight out of a horror story. One of those eerie roadside stops where bad things always seem to happen in movies. We both laughed, but I could tell from the way she held herself that she was a little uneasy. Wanting to reassure her, I told her to stay in the van with the doors locked while I filled up the tank. I stepped out, the warm night air thick around me as I started pumping gas. The rhythmic clicking of the pump, the only sound breaking the stillness. I was about halfway done when a voice suddenly spoke up from behind me, cutting through the quiet with an unsettling edge. "You lost, son?" The question caught me off guard. Not just the words themselves, but the way they were asked. I turned around to find a woman standing there staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. She looked to be in her 50s, though something about her made her seem much older. There was something off about her presence, something creepy in the way she held herself, like she was high on something. Instead of answering her question directly, I instinctively asked if she was all right, if she needed help with anything. As I spoke, my eyes darted around, scanning for a car or any sign that she had arrived with someone. But there was nothing. The place was completely empty. I asked her again if she was okay, but she didn't respond. Just kept staring at me with those two wide eyes. Something about her was deeply unsettling, sending a ripple of unease crawling up my spine. Without making it obvious, I subtly signaled to my girlfriend through the windshield, motioning for her to lock the doors. Not wanting to linger any longer than necessary, I made my way into the station and approached the guy behind the counter, casually asking if he knew the woman outside. At first, he seemed completely at ease, barely even looking up from whatever he was doing. But when he finally did glance in the direction I pointed, his entire demeanor shifted in an instant. His face hardened, his body tensed, and without saying a single word, he reached down, grabbed a Savage 110 gauge rifle, and started scanning the windows with a level of seriousness that sent my heartbeat into overdrive. I grew up around guns, so the sight of one didn't necessarily scare me, but the way he reacted did. Instinctively, I ducked a little, lowering my voice as I asked him what the hell was going on. His answer was short but chilling. He told me not to engage with her, that she was rarely ever alone, and that she was part of a group that lived deep in the mountains. He mentioned that the area had a history. People had gone missing over the years, and he was convinced that this group had something to do with it, even though the police refused to acknowledge any connection between the group and the disappearances. That was all I needed to hear. Without wasting another second, I paid for the gas, hurried back to the van, and climbed in, my pulse hammering in my ears. My girlfriend was already hunched forward in her seat, clearly trying to stay out of sight. She must have seen the guy with the rifle. I didn't stop to explain. I just started the engine and drove. She kept pressing me, practically yelling, demanding to know what was happening. Finally, I muttered that the people around here were crazy and that we needed to get as far away as possible. I thought about telling her everything, the warning, the missing people, but at that moment, I figured it would only make things worse. Besides that, these mountains are full of stories about the people who live in them. Feral people or even folklore. That doesn't mean they're all true. In fact, my tendency was to believe most of them were made up. We drove for miles until exhaustion forced me to find a place to pull over. We chose a secluded clearing off a back road somewhere. That at the time felt safe enough to rest for the night. At around 3 a.m., my girlfriend shook me awake, whispering that someone was outside the van. I sat up immediately, straining to listen. Then I heard it. Footsteps, more than one person. And not just footsteps, voices. The handle on the door rattled. Someone was trying to get in. Without thinking, I grabbed my handgun, yanked back the curtain covering the van's window, and aimed it, shouting that I wasn't afraid to use it. What I saw made my stomach drop. A group of people stood on the other side of the van. Several men with the strangest dead-eyed expressions I'd ever seen. And on the right, gripping the handle, was the woman from the gas station. Instinct took over. I aimed the gun straight at her, and I saw her take a step back. My girlfriend's grip on my arm was so tight that my whole arm was going dead. I'd been in some messed up situations before, but nothing like this. The words of the guy at the gas station were hammering in my brain. Outside, I watched them hesitate. Then, one by one, they started backing away, disappearing into the trees. By the time I turned around, my girlfriend had already jumped into the driver's seat, ready to gun it. She drove like a bat out of hell for miles before finally pulling over, shaking all over. Then I switched seats and took over the driving. I have no idea what the hell that group was doing or how they managed to find us after we had driven so far from that gas station. But I do know this. We never forgot those faces, those wide, empty eyes, and neither of us ever went back to that part of the country again. I've been a trail runner for over a decade. Started out doing short day hikes back in college just to clear my head between classes. Eventually, I graduated to longriders, multi-day loops, high elevation passes, all that good stuff. Out there, away from the noise of work, bills, phones. It's the one place I feel like I'm not pretending to have my life together. Last spring, I planned a solo trip in the 100-mile wilderness in Maine. It heads east-northeast from the town of Monson and ends outside Baxter State Park, just south of a Ball Bridge. I've been in the Appalachian countless times. In fact, at least 50% of all the solo trails I've ever done were in those mountains. But I'd never been to this part, the most isolated stretch of the Appalachian Trail. I was looking forward to the quiet. The trip was supposed to be 2 nights and 3 days. I parked my car near the old service road that cuts off the highway and started early around 7 o'clock a.m. The air still had a bite to it, and I could see my breath for the first half hour. I had my pack, my GPS, enough food and water, and a bare canister just in case. I didn't see another soul the first day, not even a squirrel, until mid-afternoon. The trail was rough, poorly maintained, which I liked. It forces you to stay alert, and I enjoy the challenge. Around 4:30, I made camp in a small clearing beside an old dried-up creek bed. Perfect spot. I set up my tent, boiled water for dinner, and jotted a few notes in my trail log. I was out cold by 9 p.m. The woods were dead quiet. Too quiet, honestly. Usually there's a soundscape. Bugs, owls, wind, but that night felt off. Still, I chalked it up to the cold snap. Animals probably hunkered down. I know it's the biggest cliché in the book, but maybe there's a reason so many people experience this kind of silence in the forest before something bad happens. Still, despite that feeling, the night passed uneventfully. It was only the second day when things started to feel truly wrong. I broke camp early and got back on the trail heading south. About a mile in, I noticed bootprints that hadn't been there the day before. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe someone had come in from a different access point. But these weren't fresh. They'd been made recently, but not within the last hour or two. What caught my eye was the direction. The prints weren't headed in or out. They zigzagged like someone had wandered off trail, then circled back. A pattern that didn't make sense. It looked like they were made by someone who was either lost and scared or completely drunk. Then I found the candy wrapper. Bright red. One of those generic gas station brand chocolates. What made it weird wasn't just the trash. It was that it was perfectly folded. Not torn, not crumpled, just folded, clean and neat, like someone had taken their time with it. I picked it up, shoved it into my trash bag, and kept going. I've never been the kind of person to leave garbage in the woods. Still, something about it stuck with me. A weird kind of intentionality. I saw the footprints again a little further on, and once again, they were completely erratic. Same person, same boots, but walking forward and back, circling, zigzagging. I started getting concerned. Whoever this was clearly wasn't well. Around noon, I stopped for a break and heard footsteps. Not wildlife, but actual human footsteps about 30 or 40 feet behind me up on the ridge to my left. I froze, listening hard, but the sound had already stopped. I scanned the ridge. Nothing, just trees, no movement, no color. I called out trying to see if anyone would respond, but there was nothing, just silence. I figured maybe it was another solo hiker who didn't want company. I get that, but the way the footsteps had stopped so suddenly gave me goosebumps, like whoever it was had been waiting for me to move again. On top of that, this area is genuinely isolated. Not that it's impossible to run into someone, but it's still strange. I was seriously starting to freak out, so I picked up the pace. That night, I camped earlier than planned. My legs were killing me, and I wanted enough time to set up before dark. I found a decent clearing and kept my gear close. Before bed, I walked the perimeter of the clearing with my headlamp just to make sure I wasn't being paranoid. Everything looked normal. No tracks until I got back to my tent and saw something sitting on top of my pack. Another candy wrapper. Same kind, same exact fold, clean and neat, placed right on top of my gear like a calling card. It's strange how something so simple yet so out of place can make you feel deeply unsettled. I kept the fire going, sat up with my headlamp on, and clutched the knife I always keep in my boot. The woods were quiet, but something wasn't right. I kept thinking about those boot prints, the bizarre path they'd taken. It might sound dramatic, but that wrapper had been placed there by someone I didn't know, someone who was clearly messing with me. Sometime around 3 a.m., I heard movement. Not the occasional twig snap that could be an animal, but pacing. Slow, deliberate pacing about 20 feet away, just outside the firelight. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. I just listened. And I swear to God, whoever it was, they were breathing heavy, like they were worked up. I stood up fast and yelled into the darkness that I was armed. Then it stopped. No retreating footsteps, no rustling, just dead silence. Unsurprisingly, I didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my gear in record time and bolted. I didn't care about finishing the route. I just wanted off that trail. About halfway back to the car, I stopped to catch my breath, eat something, and took a quick look around, just out of habit. That's when I saw him, standing among the trees, with a scruffy beard and clothes that looked about a decade old. He was maybe 50 yards behind me, standing perfectly still, just watching. When he realized I'd seen him, he raised a gun. Instinctively, I positioned myself between two trees and just ran as fast as I could toward my car. No looking back, no stopping. Finally, I reached my car, slammed the door, locked it, and tore out of there. Once I calmed down enough to think clearly, I drove straight to the nearest ranger station. I told them everything, gave them trail details, times, both campsites, even showed them the wrappers I'd kept. They were polite, listened carefully, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. Said maybe I'd crossed paths with a transient or a bush hiker living off-road. Said it wasn't uncommon in that region. They took my report, promised to check the trail, but I walked out knowing nothing would come of it. A few days later, I posted about the incident on a backcountry hiking forum. I wasn't expecting much, just needed to get it off my chest. But that's when things got real. I got a private message from a woman who said she'd had a similar experience 5 years earlier. Also in that same stretch, she'd been hiking with her brother and found small folded pieces of paper near their tent, each with a child's name and birthday written on it. She said they felt watched the whole trip, and one night, her brothers saw someone crouch near a tree just staring at them. They left the next morning, never went back. Since then, 3 more people have messaged me. One guy said he found a torn baby shoe hanging from a branch. Another woman said she was followed for 2 days by someone she never saw but could hear, always just out of view. One teenager said he heard a gun being loaded in the middle of the night. It's like there's someone out there, maybe more than one, living off that trail, terrorizing people, stalking them. Who knows what else? The stories aren't identical, but they all point to the same thing. Something's not right in that part of the mountains. I live in Swords Creek, which is a small community nestled in Russell County down in the southwestern corner of Virginia, right in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. I've lived here my whole life, and when you grow up in this part of the country, you learn almost instinctively and from a very young age a specific set of rules about the forest and the mountains, rules that over time become so ingrained in you, they feel like they're etched into your skin. I was never the kind of person to scoff at local folklore or dismiss the stories about the entities and presences people say dwell in these woods. I've witnessed my fair share of strange things over the years, some difficult to explain, but never anything that made me feel directly threatened. And I've never in all my life been someone who breaks the rules of the mountains. My home sits a little ways off from the other houses, surrounded on all sides by thick, sprawling forest, and I spent most of my childhood out in those woods with my grandfather, wandering half-forgotten trails, learning the secrets of the land, and most importantly, understanding that the only thing keeping us safe out there is a mutual respect between us and whatever else lives in these mountains. My grandfather used to say that we don't need to understand everything out there, or go looking for explanations every time we hear a whisper between the trees. We just have to respect them, and if we do, they'll return that respect in kind. That belief always gave me a strange sort of comfort, a quiet peace that made living out here feel safe, even though there were certain things I just instinctively avoided, like going outside after dark. Like I said, I've never been one to break those rules. I might have been a little rebellious in other parts of life, sure, but when it came to the forest, the mountains, and the quiet code they seemed to speak, I kept to it with something close to reverence, because no matter how tempted you are to doubt, you don't play games with the woods. Still, the truth is life can turn upside down in the blink of an eye with no warning at all. It all started to unravel at the beginning of last spring. One of my best friends, Reggie, died in a tragic accident. It was a brutal time, especially for me and James, the third part of our tight-knit little trio. We grew up together, shared every joy, every scrape, every heartbreak like brothers. And losing Reggie hit like a freight train. Even now, a whole year later, that wound still feels raw, still throbs, like it's just waiting to break open all over again. The real story started about 2 weeks ago. It marked the 1-year anniversary of Reggie's death, and James and I decided to honor him the way we knew he would have liked, with a few drinks and some shared memories. It was supposed to be a simple hangout like so many we'd had on birthdays or meaningful dates. But this time, Reggie's absence was impossible to ignore. The night was heavy with grief. The weight of realizing our trio was permanently broken was too much. And maybe that's why we drank more than we should have, trying to drown that ache with alcohol and laughter that didn't quite reach our eyes. The night was warm, typical for early spring, and we stayed out on the back patio, talking and reminiscing. That's when my two cats started meowing loudly and in a way that didn't sit right. They usually roam around during the day, but they don't come up to the windows at night. And on this night, they were especially agitated. Worried, I went inside to check on them, and though they were shaken up, they seemed unharmed. I went back outside and sat with James, and we kept drinking. It was already late when we decided to call it a night. James was a lot more drunk than I was, and I tried to convince him to crash on my couch. I didn't want anything to happen to him, but he insisted on heading home. He only lived about a 7-minute walk away, and even though everything in me screamed not to do it, I decided to walk him there just to be sure he made it back safe. That meant for the first time in years, I broke the rule about going into the woods after dark. But the truth is, I couldn't bear the thought of losing another brother, and in the state he was in, it wouldn't have taken much. A single misstep, a fall to make that happen. Getting him home went fine. No weird vibes, no strange noises. But on the walk back, I started to feel something that chilled me to the bone. It's hard to describe clearly, maybe because of the drinking. But I remember how the forest slowly sank into a silence so deep and unnatural. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, just as my house came into view, I heard my name whispered from the trees. Any other night, I would have walked straight inside and locked the door behind me, pretending I didn't hear it. But that voice, it was Reggie's, and in my vulnerable state, I couldn't help myself. I turned and walked toward the tree line behind my house, toward the forest. I was just about to step across that symbolic threshold, the place where the backyard ends and the deep woods begin, when something snapped me out of it. It hit me like a lightning bolt. I was about to break another rule. That couldn't have been Reggie. I was at his funeral. I saw his body. Without a second thought, I turned and bolted back to the house, locking every door and window I could get my hands on, while my cats darted around the living room like they could feel it, too, that something was off. My grandfather's words, once a comfort, now rang in my ears like a warning. I figured the best thing I could do was go to bed and try to forget the whole thing, chalk it up to the alcohol and the grief playing tricks on me. In the days that followed, I did everything I could to convince myself I'd imagined it, that none of it had actually happened. But as the nights passed, they started to feel heavier. It was like something was watching me, something I couldn't see. My cats, usually bold and independent, started staying inside constantly, refusing to even go near the windows after dark. I finally decided to tell James what had happened, even though I knew how it might sound. I texted him, told him I needed to talk to him, asked if he could swing by. He responded right away, said he was just getting off work, that he'd stop by home real quick to change and head over. Since I had a little time, I hopped in the shower. I had barely stepped under the water when I heard someone knocking at the door. I figured James had changed his mind and come straight over. So I opened the bathroom window, which faces the back of the house, right where the knock came from, and yelled out for him to use the spare key hidden in the planter. I rushed through the shower, towel dried in record time, and stepped out. But the air in the house felt wrong, colder than it should have been, like maybe the door had been left open. I called out his name, but no answer. Looked out the window and realized it was already completely dark outside. Called again, still nothing. Dead silence. I went downstairs and the front door was wide open, but James wasn't there. I picked up my phone and saw a new message from him sent just a few minutes earlier, saying he'd gotten stuck at work and wouldn't be able to make it until after 9:30. The cold that hit me then didn't come from the night air. It came from somewhere deep inside where dread starts to settle like stone. That door had been locked. Someone had opened it. I slammed it shut and locked it, then went through the house room by room, searching for any sign of someone or something. But there was nothing. No sound, no shadow. Just my cats crouched behind the couch, frozen stiff like they'd seen something the human I can't. Since that night, something shifted. I don't know how to explain it, but I know with a kind of fear I've never felt before that something is out there, watching, waiting. And for the first time in my life, I'm truly afraid. Not just of the forest or the mountains, but of whatever inhabits in them. And of the fact that it clearly doesn't forget. And it sure as hell doesn't forgive when you break the rules. In the spring of 2017, I was living near Black Mountain in North Carolina. I thought I understood these mountains, but an incident during that time proved me wrong. My name is Robert. I'm 61 years old, and I grew up in these mountains. Before leaving for college and a career in the city, I came back to Black Mountain to retire, to reconnect with my roots, to find some peace in my final years. The cabin I rented was old, built sometime in the 60s, perched about halfway up the eastern slope of the mountain. It had good bones, a view through the trees toward the valley below, a creek running about a quarter mile away, quiet, perfect. I spent my first week settling in, unpacking, exploring the property and the surrounding forest. Everything felt right. The air, the silence, the sense of being removed from the modern world. I started developing routines, coffee in the morning on the porch, walks through the forest, reading in the afternoon, cooking simple meals. But around day 10, I noticed something odd. There were marks on the trees near the cabin, fresh marks. Someone had been blazing the forest, cutting small V-shaped notches into the bark at regular intervals, marking a path. Except I was pretty sure I'd never seen them before, and they seemed to radiate outward from my cabin in multiple directions. At first, I thought maybe they'd been made before I arrived, and I just hadn't noticed. But the cuts looked fresh. The exposed wood hadn't dried or discolored. Someone had made them recently. I asked my landlord about it the next time he came by. He looked uncomfortable, said he didn't know anything about them, that they probably weren't anything to worry about. Then he changed the subject quickly. Over the next week, I became aware of other things. Marks on rocks, piles of stones arranged in specific patterns, almost like markers. A circle of trees that had all been burned on one side at approximately the same height, like they'd been marked by fire at some point in the past. The forest surrounding my cabin was a palimpsest of marks. Once I started noticing them, I couldn't stop. They were everywhere. Everywhere I walked, everything I looked at, there were signs of intentional marking, like the mountain itself was covered in a language I didn't know how to read. I asked some locals about it, took a trip into the nearest town and mentioned what I'd found. The responses were evasive. One older man, who'd lived in the area his entire life, asked me where exactly the marks were. When I described the general location, he just shook his head. They've always been up there, he said. Everybody knows not to mess with them. Mess with what, exactly? What are they? Markers, he said. Ways people keep track of things, or things keep track of people. Depends on how old they are. I pressed him for more information, but he wouldn't give it. He just kept saying I should be careful, should probably hire someone to clear some of the growth around my cabin, should maybe get some lights installed, make the place less isolated. But the more I explored, the more I realized that the isolation was the point. The marks weren't random, they were intentional, and they created a pattern, a structure, a system. I started mapping them, drew the locations on a topographic map of the area. The marks radiated from my cabin in specific directions. There were concentrations in certain areas, gaps in others. The more I mapped, the more I realized I was looking at something that had been set up deliberately, systematically, with clear purpose. Then I found the structure. Deep in the forest, about 2 miles from my cabin, hidden in a dense grove of old-growth hemlocks. It was built into the mountain itself, a stone structure that looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer, a small house or shelter, maybe 10 feet on each side, with no door but an opening that faced the valley. There was nothing inside, no furniture, no artifacts, nothing that suggested what it had been used for, but there were marks on the interior walls, scratches, carvings, things that might have been symbols or might have just been damage from time and weather. And there were more marks leading away from it, the system of blazes on the trees. The piles of stones continued beyond the structure, deeper into the forest, higher up the mountain. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed thinking about that structure, about the marks, about the fact that someone or multiple people had spent considerable time and effort setting up this system throughout the forest around my cabin. The next morning, I decided to follow the marks higher up the mountain. I packed a day bag, grabbed my map, and started climbing. Following the blazes and stone markers up the slope, the marks led me higher and higher, through increasingly dense forest, until the trees started to thin out as I approached the summit. And there, on a rocky outcropping near the peak, I found something that stopped me cold. It was a flat area, maybe 20 feet across, completely clear of vegetation, and covering every inch of that clearing were stones, thousands of them, all arranged in concentric circles, spirals, patterns that seemed to radiate outward from a central point. The stones were of different sizes, different colors, deliberately placed. It was a mandala, a labyrinth, a map. I couldn't decide what it was, only that it was intentional and enormous and incomprehensibly intricate. In the center was a stone marker, about 3 feet tall, with markings carved into it, not in English, not in any language I recognized, just symbols, lines, shapes that suggested communication without providing actual meaning. I stood there for a long time, just looking at it, trying to understand what I was seeing, trying to understand what it meant that this entire system, the marks on the trees, the stone piles, the structure in the forest, the massive arrangement on the summit all radiated from my cabin as though my cabin was the center, the reference point, the origin of the entire system. I don't know who built these things. I don't know how long they've been there, but I know that I'm still living in that cabin, and I know that I've stopped exploring the forest. I stick to the areas around the house, places where I can still see the structure, places where I'm not adding to whatever this is. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear sounds from the forest, not animal sounds, sounds that might be people, or might be wind, or might be something else entirely. Sounds that seem to follow the paths marked by those old blazes. Sounds that circle through the forest in patterns I don't want to understand. I'm too old to start over somewhere new, and I'm stubborn enough not to be driven away. But I'm also aware, now, that I don't understand these mountains nearly as well as I thought. And whatever system has been established on Black Mountain, I'm living right at its center. I had been in Appalachia for only a short while when this occurred. It was the winter of 2015, and I was staying near Harlan in eastern Kentucky, surrounded by mountains and quiet roads. My name is Sarah. I'm 31 years old, and I'd come to Appalachia after a bad breakup to stay with my grandmother in her house, while I figured out my next steps. My grandmother's house was old, built sometime in the 1920s, according to family stories, perched on a hillside with views down into a valley. It had been in my family for generations, passed down through my grandmother's side. The structure was solid, though the interior showed its age, creaking floors, old plumbing, windows that rattled in their frames when the wind picked up. I hadn't been to the house in years. Since I was a kid, really, my grandmother had kept it maintained, but it still had that smell of old houses, the particular scent of decades and dust and accumulated time. My grandmother died during my second week there. It was sudden. She'd been fine in the morning, and by afternoon she'd had a stroke. She was in the hospital within an hour, but she never regained consciousness. She died 2 days later. Everything after that was a blur of funeral arrangements, staying with relatives, processing paperwork. By the time things had settled down, I was the one responsible for the house. My grandmothers will left it to me. Suddenly, I owned this old structure, this piece of my family's history, and I had no idea what to do with it. I decided to stay for a while, to process my grief, to figure out what I wanted to do with the property. My parents offered to help, but I declined. I needed to be alone. So I stayed in my grandmother's house. The first few days were hard. Every corner reminded me of her, of childhood visits, of her presence in my life. I found myself crying at random moments, missing her intensely. But something shifted after her funeral, after the relatives had gone and I was truly alone in the house. The house started showing me things. I don't mean ghosts or supernatural apparitions, nothing that dramatic, but details, memories, moments that seemed to exist in the house itself, in the walls and floorboards and furniture. I'd walk into the kitchen and suddenly remember my grandmother making biscuits when I was 7 years old. Not a fleeting memory, but vivid, immersive, like I was actually there. Like the memory had a presence in the physical space. I could smell the biscuits baking. I could feel the warmth of the oven. I could hear her humming. I'd sit in the living room and experience moments from my parents' childhood that they'd told me about years ago. My mother playing piano in the front room. My father and uncle building a fort out of couch cushions. Moments I'd never witnessed, but that the house seemed to be showing me, storing, preserving. At first, I thought it was grief. Thought I was manifesting these memories through my sadness and loss. But the memories became more detailed. I started seeing things my family had never told me about. Private moments between my grandparents. Conversations my grandmother had with people I'd never met. Incidents that had happened in the house before I was even born. I started writing them down. At first just phrases, then full descriptions of what I was experiencing. It became clear that I wasn't imagining these memories. They were specific, consistent, detailed in ways that my grief-stricken brain couldn't have constructed. They included information I had no way of knowing. I called my mother and asked her about some of the things I was remembering. She was shocked. Some of them were exactly accurate moments she'd told no one about. Intimate details of her life in that house. Others were things she'd never told me, but that she confirmed were true. When I described them, "The house is showing you things," she said quietly. "I was afraid of that." "What do you mean, afraid of that? Why would you be afraid?" She took a long time answering. Finally, she told me something she'd never mentioned before, that her mother, my grandmother, used to say the house had memory, that it absorbed the lives of the people who lived in it, stored their moments, their emotions, their experiences in the structure itself, that sometimes, for people who belonged to the family, for people connected by blood to the original inhabitants, the house would share those memories. She said it wasn't disturbing. My mother continued. She said it was like the house was helping you understand your place in your family, your history. But she also said some people didn't like it. Some people found it overwhelming, having the house show them things they weren't ready to know. I understood what she meant. The longer I stayed, the more the house showed me, the more overwhelming it became. I was experiencing my grandmother's entire life, or at least the parts that had happened in that house. Her loneliness after my grandfather died, her worries about her children, her fears, her regrets, her quiet moments of joy. It was too much, too intimate, too invasive, even though the house wasn't trying to hurt me. I tried to leave, to get away from the house for a while, but I'd get in my car to drive away, and I'd find myself pulling the car over and getting out. Unable to actually leave, the memories would intensify when I tried to go. It was like the house was desperate to show me everything before I left. I finally drove away after 2 months. I couldn't take it anymore. I left the house locked up and haven't been back. But here's what keeps me awake. I can still feel it sometimes, when I'm quiet, when I'm not thinking about anything specific. I can feel the house reaching out to me across the distance, trying to show me more, trying to share more memories. And I'm starting to worry that the memories aren't from the past anymore, that the house is storing new things, new moments, as my life continues. That when I go back, and I know I'll eventually have to go back, to sell it or settle my grandmother's remaining affairs, the house will be waiting to show me memories of my own life that I'm not ready to see yet. That my grandmother died in that house, and I think it's still trying to show me what that moment was like. I think it's waiting for me to come back so it can share her death with me, the way it shared everything else, and I'm not sure I'm strong enough to experience that. In the early days of the autumn of 2018, I was spending time near Leanville Gorge in the Appalachian Mountains. I didn't expect anything unusual, but I was wrong. My name is Thomas. I'm 56 years old, and I'm a musicologist who specializes in folk music and regional vocal traditions. I'd come to Leanville Gorge specifically to research the area's musical heritage, hoping to document some of the old songs that local residents still remembered. The gorge itself is stunning steep cliffs, a river running through the bottom, trails that offer incredible views. I arranged to stay with a local family who agreed to let me interview them about their musical traditions and family history. The first week was productive. I conducted interviews with 3 different families, recorded several traditional songs, learned about the musical heritage of the area. It was exactly the kind of research I'd hoped to find: real people, real traditions, music that had been passed down through generations and was still actively maintained. But in the second week, I started hearing something else, a voice singing. I first noticed it when I was hiking one of the gorge trails. It was late afternoon, the light getting golden, the shadows starting to lengthen. The voice seemed to come from somewhere up the gorge, carrying along with the sound of the river. It was female, high and clear, singing in a style that reminded me of the traditional Appalachian music I'd been documenting, but also different, told her somehow, or stranger. I couldn't make out the words, but the melody was haunting, repetitive in a way that suggested it was a very old song, something traditional. I tried to locate the source, but couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. The sound seemed to echo off the gorge walls, bouncing around, making it impossible to determine direction. I mentioned it to the family I was staying with that evening. The man, who was in his 70s, got very quiet. "You heard singing?" his wife asked. "In the gorge?" "Yes, up toward the upper canyon." "Beautiful voice. I'm wondering if there might be other singers in the area I haven't documented yet." The couple exchanged a look. "There's singing in the gorge sometimes," the man said carefully, "but it's usually at night, and people who follow it tend to get lost." "Lost?" I asked. "The gorge is treacherous at night," he said. "Steep drops, slick rocks, places where a person can fall pretty easily. Few people who've tried to follow the singing at night have made it back out without incident." I told him I'd only been hearing it during the day, and that I had no intention of following it anywhere. But I was intrigued. The idea that there might be a traditional singer I hadn't documented yet, someone keeping the old songs alive, was exactly the kind of discovery I'd come looking for. Over the next few days, I heard the singing multiple times, always in the late afternoon, always carrying from somewhere up the gorge, always the same melody or variations on it. I started recording it with my portable audio equipment, capturing whatever I could of the voice and the song. I also started trying to identify the song. It sounded old, centuries old possibly, but I couldn't place it exactly. It reminded me of some ballads I'd encountered before, traditional narrative songs that told stories of lost love or tragedy. But the words weren't quite right. Either I wasn't hearing them clearly enough, or they were in a form of the language that predated modern usage. On day 9, I decided to hike up the gorge toward where the singing seemed to originate. The family tried to discourage me, but I assured them I'd stay in the daylight and not venture anywhere dangerous. I promised to be back before dark. I hiked into the upper section of the gorge, following the river and the trails. The singing got no closer, but also didn't get further away. It seemed to maintain the same distance, always just ahead, always just out of reach. I hiked for several hours, further than I'd planned to go. The gorge became more narrow, the walls steeper. In some places, the trail was treacherous narrow ledges, with long drops to the river below. I should have turned back, but I could hear the singing more clearly now. I could almost make out words, and I was certain that if I could just get a little closer, I could identify the song and perhaps locate the singer. The light was getting golden, shadows stretching across the gorge, when I finally stopped and really listened to what I was hearing. The words became clear enough to understand. It was a story, a narrative in old Appalachian dialect or something older still. A song about a woman, a betrayal, a death. It was the kind of ballad that had probably been around for hundreds of years, but I'd never encountered this particular version before. I pulled out my recording equipment and documented as much of it as I could. The voice was beautiful and terrible at once, technically perfect, but also somehow hollow, like it was coming from someplace that wasn't quite real. When the song ended, there was silence, absolute silence. The river stopped sounding. The wind stopped moving. Even the light seemed to stop changing. Then I heard breathing, coming from somewhere very close to me. Very close, but not visible. I turned around, my heart pounding. The gorge around me was empty. No one visible. Nothing obvious that could be breathing so close I could hear it over the sound of my own rapid heartbeat. I didn't stay to investigate. I turned and hiked back down the gorge as fast as I safely could, moving through the fading light, trying not to look behind me. I could still hear breathing, following me, matching my pace. By the time I got back to the family's house, it was dark. They took one look at me and asked if I'd been in the gorge. When I nodded, they didn't ask any more questions. They just told me to sit down and gave me a strong drink. The next day, I was sick. High fever, severe headache, weakness. I stayed in bed for 2 days while the family took care of me. On the third day, the fever broke, and I felt well enough to travel. I packed my equipment and left Leanville Gorge. But before I left, I tried to review the recordings I'd made of the singing. They were corrupted somehow, unplayable. I tried different audio software, different devices, but the files wouldn't open or played only as noise, static, and distortion instead of the clear Voice ID recorded. I've spent the years since trying to identify that song. I've consulted with other musicologists, examined historical ballad collections, researched Appalachian folk traditions extensively. I've never found the song anywhere. It's as though it exists only in that gorge, sung by a voice that shouldn't be there, a melody that predates our current understanding of musical tradition. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I can almost hear it again. That beautiful, hollow voice, singing words I almost understand, telling a story I'm not sure I want to know. I suspect that whatever that was, it's still in Leanville Gorge, still singing in the late afternoons, still trying to lead people deeper into the canyon. And I suspect it will be there long after I'm gone, maintaining a tradition that no one can quite remember, and that everyone who encounters it wishes they could forget. Back in November of 2016, I was staying in a small place near Clingman's Dome in the Great Smoky Mountains. I had been there only a few days when things started to feel strange. My name is Derek. I'm 29 years old, and I'd come to the mountains to work as a freelance photographer, shooting landscape photography for a travel website. I'd rented a small cabin about 2 miles from the popular tourist area. In a quieter section of the park, the first 2 days were productive. I hiked to various viewpoints, took hundreds of photographs, managed my equipment, worked on editing. The mountains were beautiful in their late autumn state. Trees bare or nearly bare, mist hanging in the valleys, the air crisp and clear at higher elevations. On the third evening, I noticed people in the distance. I was editing photos on my laptop when I glanced out the window and saw figures moving through the forest about 100 yards from my cabin. There were several of them, and they seemed to be walking deliberately, following some kind of path through the trees. I didn't think much of it at first. The park has trails, and people hike them even in November. But then I noticed something. None of them were carrying any gear. No backpacks, no water bottles, no hats or jackets despite the cold. They were just walking, in a group, moving through the forest with purpose. I went back to my editing, but the sight of them had registered in some way. Later that night, I heard sounds outside. Footsteps on the porch, not heavy, not aggressive, just present. Someone or something was walking around my cabin, circling it slowly, deliberately. I turned off all the lights and waited. The footsteps continued for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped. By the time I felt brave enough to look outside with a flashlight, there was no one there. No tracks in the dirt, no sign that anyone had actually been there at all. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a bear, maybe, or a large deer. I was jumpy from being alone. from the quiet, from my own imagination in the dark. But the next day, I saw the people again. Same group, same lack of gear, same deliberate walking. This time I counted them. 8 people, all of them walking in single file, all of them moving with the same pace, the same stride, the same head position, like they were synchronized, like they were one organism pretending to be 8 separate entities. I tried to photograph them, but by the time I got my camera ready, they'd disappeared behind the trees. I zoomed in on where they'd been, but there was nothing visible. No sign they'd ever been there at all. That night, the footsteps came back. This time there were more of them, and they circled the cabin multiple times. I could hear them moving. Around the porch, could hear the boards creaking under unseen weight. Could hear something that might have been breathing against the cabin walls. I called the park ranger station and reported possible trespassing. The ranger I spoke to sounded annoyed. He said hikers sometimes cut through private property, that there wasn't much he could do about it unless they were causing property damage. He asked if they'd bothered me directly. I said no, just that. They'd been near my cabin at night. They're probably just passing through, he said. Not much you can do about it. Just lock your doors. I locked my doors. I also locked all the windows and left every light in the cabin on. The people appeared again on day 5 and again on day 6, but now I was paying closer attention to the details. Their clothes were odd, not quite the right style or fit for modern hikers, but not old enough to be historical either. It was like they were wearing approximations of hiking clothes, like someone had described what hikers wore, and these people had dressed based on a second-hand description. And their faces. When I managed to get close enough to see their faces through my camera lens, there was something deeply wrong with them, not disfigured or injured, just wrong. Like they weren't quite assembled correctly, like the features were in roughly the right positions, but not precisely calibrated. On the night of day 6, I heard them try the door. The handle turned slowly, deliberately, testing the lock. Then they tried the windows, all of them, methodically, one at a time, checking each one. It took about an hour. Then they started tapping on the glass, not violently, not threateningly, just tapping, tap, 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 a pattern, a rhythm. I called the ranger station again. A different ranger answered, and when I described what was happening, there was a long silence. You need to leave, he said finally. Pack your things and drive out of the park right now. Don't wait until morning. What are they? I asked. What's happening? Just leave, please. Don't ask questions, just go. I packed my car in about 15 minutes. I didn't bother sorting through my equipment carefully, just threw everything in the back. The moment I had enough to drive away, I started the engine and drove toward the park exit. As I drove, I could see them in my headlights. The group of 8, walking along the road, moving in the same synchronized way. Their heads turning as my car passed, like they were following me with their eyes. I pressed the accelerator and didn't look back. I made it out of the park and drove all the way to the nearest town, where I got a motel room. In the morning, I tried to go back for the rest of my equipment, but I didn't make it very far into the park before I saw them again. Standing beside the road, waiting, I turned around and drove back to the town. I filed a report with the park ranger office, filed a report with local police, tried to explain what I'd experienced. Everyone took it seriously to a point, but no one seemed to know what I was talking about. No one had reports of other incidents. Like this, no one had any explanation for who or what these people were. I've never gone back to Klingman's Dome, but I've learned some things since. I've researched the area, and there are stories not well known, not widely circulated, but existing in local folklore and park ranger anecdotes. Stories about people who don't quite belong in the mountains, people who appear during certain times of year, people who seem to be looking for something, or looking for someone, or perhaps just looking for more people to join their group. I think they were trying to get into my cabin for a reason. I think they wanted something from me, or wanted me to join them. And I think the ranger knew exactly what they were, and why he needed me to leave immediately. I've kept all my photographs from that trip, and in the background of several of them, barely visible, are figures in the trees, 8 figures, standing perfectly still, all of them facing toward the cabin where I was staying. It was the summer of 2019, and I had traveled to the Appalachian region for a short break. My cabin near Pisgah Forest felt peaceful at first. My name is Patricia. I'm 47 years old, and I work as a hydrologist studying water systems and watersheds. I'd taken a 2-week vacation specifically to stay in a remote cabin and decompress from the stress of work. The cabin was perfect. It had everything I needed: electricity, running water, a kitchen, a porch. It was set back from the main road, surrounded by dense forest, and had a creek running about 50 yards from the back door. I could see the water from my porch here. At night when I had the windows open, it was exactly the kind of peace I'd been craving. For the first week, I existed in that peaceful state. I read, I cooked, I took short walks through the forest. I sat on the porch and listened to the water. I didn't work, didn't check email, didn't think about the office. Then came the rain. It started on day 8, a steady drizzle that developed into a full rainstorm by evening. The weather forecast had called for rain, so I wasn't concerned. Rain in the mountains is normal, expected. I settled in to listen to it, made tea, spent the evening watching the trees move in the wind and rain. The rain lasted all night and into the next day. By morning, it was falling hard, a heavy downpour that hammered against the windows. Still within the realm of normal. I'd seen worse on vacation. But the rain didn't stop. All day, all night, it continued. By the morning of day 3, the intensity had moderated slightly, but the rain was still falling steadily. I checked the weather. A low-pressure system had stalled over the region, expected to continue for at least another 24 hours. I wasn't worried yet. Cabins are built to handle rain. I had food, electricity, books. I could wait it out. By day 4, however, something had changed. The sound of the water had become constant, all-encompassing. It wasn't just the rain on the roof and windows anymore. The creek, which had been audible at a pleasant level, was now roaring. I could hear it from anywhere in the cabin, a deep, aggressive sound of water moving with power and purpose. I went to the porch to look at the creek. It had swollen considerably. No longer a peaceful stream, but a rushing torrent of muddy brown water, pulling branches and debris along in its current. The water level was higher than I would have expected, even accounting for the extended rainfall. I checked my phone. He checked my phone. Still had signal. I called the cabin's property manager and asked if this was normal, if I should be concerned. "You're fine," he said, but he sounded uncertain. "The creek floods sometimes, but the cabin's built high enough. Just stay inside. Keep away from the water. It'll recede once the rain stops." "When will the rain stop?" I asked. "Weather service is saying another day or 2. Could go longer depending on the system." "You've got supplies." I assured him I did, and we hung up. But something about his hesitation had gotten under my skin. He'd answered too quickly, like he was reassuring himself as much as me. The rain continued. By day 5, I stopped counting the hours and just accepted the sound as constant background. The roar of the creek had become so loud that I had to speak up if I was talking to myself. I'd moved my sleeping area to the upstairs bedroom, as far from the rising water as possible. Though the cabin was built on a slope, the creek was still probably 100 yards downhill. That night, I heard something besides the rain and the water, a sound that shouldn't have been there, a kind of singing, not words, not quite music, but something with a rhythm and a pitch. It seemed to come from the direction of the creek, and it was carrying over the sound of the rain and the rushing water in a way that shouldn't have been physically possible. I went to the window and looked out toward where the creek should be. In the darkness, with rain hammering against the glass, I could see nothing, but the sound continued. It was haunting, almost beautiful, and absolutely not human. When I woke the next morning, the rain had stopped. The sun was coming through the clouds, and there was an eerie quiet that felt somehow wrong after days of constant noise. I went downstairs and looked out at the forest. Everything was different. The creek, still swollen and moving fast, had created a landscape I didn't recognize. Trees that had been on one side of the water were now on the other, or had disappeared entirely. The forest floor was a mass of mud and debris. The clearing where I'd walked on my first few days was underwater, a shallow lake, that hadn't been there before. But what made me stop breathing was what I saw on the creek bank nearest the cabin. There were marks on the trees, recent marks, deep gouged in the bark, ranged in patterns, all of them facing toward the cabin. They looked like claw marks, except they were too deliberate, too evenly spaced, too intentional to be from any animal I knew. And there were so many of them, covering multiple trees, creating a visual path that led directly from the creek toward my cabin. I should have left immediately, but I'm a scientist, and I was curious. I put on boots and went down to examine the marks more closely, up close. They were even more unsettling. The gouges were deep, cut through the bark to the wood beneath, and there was something odd about the angle of them. They looked like they'd been made by something reaching from the water toward the land, something pulling itself up and out of the creek. There were also marks on the porch posts of the cabin, the same type of gouges, fresh enough that the exposed wood was still slightly damp. Whatever had made them had reached the cabin itself. That's when I realized I could still hear something. Not the roar of the creek anymore, but something quieter, a kind of humming or singing, similar to what I'd heard during the night. It seemed to come from all around me, from the trees, the ground, the air itself. I went back inside and packed my car in a panic. I didn't shower, didn't clean up, didn't do anything but grab my clothes and toiletries and get out of that cabin. I drove away with wet tires on the muddy road, and I didn't stop until I was back at the small town where I'd rented the cabin, in a motel with other people and lights and noise. I never went back to Pisgah Forest. I told the property manager there was a family emergency, and I forfeited my deposit. What I couldn't explain to anyone was what I'd seen or heard. I'm trained in hydrology, in understanding water systems, in predicting water behavior. What I experienced didn't fit into any framework I understood. The singing, the marks, the sense that something in the water was aware of me and trying to reach me, none of it has a rational explanation. But I've looked at the data since. Flood records for that area, precipitation patterns, hydrological reports, and I've found something that frightens me more than the marks on the trees or the singing in the night. The same pattern has occurred before, in 1987, in 1994, in 2003. Extended rainfall periods followed by reports of strange marks and unusual sounds from people who'd been in the area during the flooding. And then nothing, for several years, until the next wet season brought the pattern back. I think something lives in the watershed around Pisgah Forest, something that awakens when water flows through the system in certain ways, something that uses the rain and the flooding as a way to move through the landscape. And I think I heard it singing the night before it reached the cabin. I've changed my career focus. I don't study water systems anymore, and I never travel to Appalachia during the rainy season. I spent the autumn of 2020 in Appalachia, staying close to the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia. What happened during that stay still follows me in ways I can't fully describe. My name is Marcus. I'm 33 years old, and I was driving through Appalachia on a kind of pilgrimage. My mother had been from the Blue Ridge region, and after she died, I decided to spend some time exploring where she'd come from before. Moving away, I'd rented a cottage in a small town in the mountains, nothing fancy, just a place to sleep and regroup between my explorations. I spent my days hiking, visiting historical sites, talking to people who might have known relatives or old family friends. It was peaceful, meditative, a way of connecting with a part of my past I'd never really known. On my 5th day there, I decided to explore a road that wasn't on my official hiking maps, but that appeared on an older, topographic map I'd found at a local used bookstore. The road was marked as maintained, but also seemed to be somewhat remote, leading up into the mountains toward a place called Ashford Hollow. I drove up the narrow asphalt road, winding higher and higher into the hills. The road was older, cracked in places, with sections where the forest had reclaimed parts of the edges, but it was still drivable. I kept thinking about my mother, wondering if she'd ever driven this road, if she'd explored these mountains the way I was doing now. After about 20 minutes of driving, I noticed something odd. The road ahead seemed familiar. Not specifically, not in a "I remember this exact spot" way, but in an overall sense. The curve of the road, the specific grouping of trees, the way the landscape opened and closed around me. I'd seen this before. Then, I realized I was seeing it again. I'd passed this exact spot 5 minutes ago. I kept driving, assuming I'd gotten confused. Maybe convinced myself I was at a place I'd already been when in fact I was just in a similar looking section of road. But it kept happening. Every 5 or 10 minutes, I'd pass a distinctive landmark, a scarred rock face, a dead tree in a particular shape, a rusted mailbox hung on a pole, and I'd recognize it from earlier in the drive. The road was looping, not in a tight circular way that I could see, but gradually, incrementally, folding back on itself in a way that wasn't immediately apparent, but that was undeniable. Once I started paying attention, I stopped the car and tried to mark my location. On my phone's GPS, it showed me moving forward, making progress up the mountain. But my eyes were telling me something different. My eyes were telling me I was driving in a repeating circuit, not advancing. I decided to turn around. I'd driven for maybe 40 minutes by that point. I turned the car around and headed back down the mountain, but after what seemed like the same amount of driving time in the opposite direction. I came around a curve and found myself at the point where I'd turned around. My car suddenly facing back up the mountain. I didn't turn around. Again, I just drove forward, continuing up the road, trying to maintain my orientation by watching the time and the GPS, even though both seemed to be lying to me in complementary ways. This is where it gets hard to explain, because I was definitely driving forward. The car was ascending. The altitude was increasing according to my elevation gauge. I was making progress on the map, each minute advancing me further up the mountain. But I kept passing the same landmarks, the scarred rock, the dead tree, the rusted mailbox. Over and over, each time they appeared, I'd mark the time, each time. The interval was approximately the same dot. After about an hour of this, I pulled over. Again, I was panicking, trying to think clearly. There was no cell service out here, so I couldn't call for help. My GPS was useless. It said I was making forward progress while everything else suggested I was stuck in a loop. I got out of the car and tried to understand what was happening. The road stretched ahead of me, disappearing into the mountains. Behind me, it curved back the way I'd come. It looked like a normal road. There was nothing visually wrong with it, but the road itself seemed to be folding through space in a way that shouldn't be possible. An older truck came around the curve. Then, a man was driving, maybe in his 70s, grizzled and weathered. He slowed as he approached me. "Car trouble?" he asked out the window. No, my car's fine. But the road. I've been driving up this road for almost 2 hours, and I keep coming back to the same spots. The man nodded like I'd told him something he already knew. "Yeah, that road does that. You're on Ashford Road. Is it? Is it always like this? Or is there something wrong with the road?" "Nothing wrong with the road," he said. "It's been that way since people started paying attention to it. Different people see different things on that road, but mostly it takes you back to where you started. Some people say it's a path that leads backward no matter which direction you drive. Some people say it's a road that doesn't want you to reach the end. How do I get off it?" He pointed back down the road. "You came from that direction. Just drive that way and don't stop. Don't turn around. Don't second guess yourself. Just drive. You'll get off it eventually. It'll take longer than it should, but you'll get there." "How do you drive this road?" I asked. "I know what to expect. You just drive forward and accept that nothing's getting you where you think you're going. Takes the frustration out of it." He drove on, disappearing around a curve ahead of me, and I never saw him again. I got back in my car and drove down the mountain the way he'd told me. For an hour and 40 minutes, I passed the same landmarks repeatedly, watching them cycle by, refusing to turn around or stop, just driving. And then, suddenly, I was at the base of the mountain, at a normal road. Intersection, completely off Ashford Road. I never drove back up that road. But sometimes when I'm thinking about my mother, about where she came from and who she was before she left these mountains, I wonder if she'd driven Ashford Road. And if what I experienced was the reason she'd stayed away for so long, the road is still there. I confirmed it on Google Maps. It's marked as a maintained route that leads to Ashford Hollow, and according to some maps, it's a straightforward 15-minute drive. But other maps, older maps, suggest something different. I just know that road doesn't go forward the way roads are supposed to. It takes you somewhere else. Somewhere that loops and folds. Somewhere that's designed to send you back to where you started no matter how far you drive. What I'm about to tell you happened about a year ago during one of my many road trips. Those solitary journeys where I drive for long stretches without a fixed destination, just aiming to soak in the scenery, explore small trails, and feel the freedom of being alone in the world. I've always loved that sense of adventure, but the truth is my car, old and without air conditioning, forced me to do most of the driving at night, especially now that spring was pushing temperatures up to uncomfortable levels. For anyone crossing deep into the heartland, that particular night, I started driving around 10:30 p.m., fully aware that I wouldn't reach my planned destination until close to 5 in the morning. I was passing through West Virginia, specifically one of its most remote stretches in the Appalachian, a region that, to be completely honest, had never really won me over, though its winding roads and dense forests held a raw, authentic beauty. I'd carried bad memories of that place for years after a hike gone wrong, left me with a lingering sense of unease every time I passed through. Still, the shortcut was worth it, and I moved forward without much hesitation. The road, as you'd expect at that hour and in such a remote area, was swallowed in total darkness, except for a few rare moments when I reached higher ground and could spot the scattered lights of isolated homes on distant hills. The solitude was absolute. The silence was so complete that at times it felt like even my car was an intruder. In that unchanging frozen landscape, it was during one of these stretches that something hidden among the thick trees lining the road caught my attention. A strong, intense light, like the beam of a flashlight, cut through the darkness for just a few seconds. Between my speed and the suddenness of the moment, I couldn't make out exactly what it was, and I didn't even consider slowing down to check it out. Whatever it was, I much preferred it stayed far away from me. I kept driving for several miles until all of a sudden, I was hit with an urgent need to pee. Something that, due to a health condition I developed a few years back, comes on suddenly and uncontrollably. Even though I'm still relatively young, I didn't have much choice. I had to pull over right there on the side of the road, surrounded on all sides by dense forest. While the darkness around my car felt almost solid, I parked, opened the door, and had barely started to relieve myself when out of nowhere, a man came screaming out of the shadows like some flesh and blood ghost, pointing a long rifle straight at my chest. Without giving me a second to react, he demanded that I let him into the car, yelling that I had two options: either give him a ride or he'd take the car by force. In a moment of pure terror, I briefly considered trying to reach the small pistol I kept in the glove box, but realized I didn't stand a chance. He was already way too close. I motioned for him to get in, trying to stay as calm as I could while mentally begging him not to hurt me. For the longest 10 minutes of my life, the man kept the rifle trained on me while I, forced to keep my cool, kept repeating calm phrases, telling him I wasn't going to try anything, that he could lower the gun, that I'd take him wherever he wanted without any trouble. But he didn't waver. His gaze, wild and bloodshot, looked more like a cornered animal's than a human being's. He kept glancing nervously at the mirrors, his body coiled tight like a spring, ready to snap. When I asked him in a low voice where he wanted to go, he just said to keep driving. So I did, following that narrow, winding road through the mountains, not seeing another soul, feeling every second pressed down on my chest like time itself was dragging on purpose. I couldn't say how long we drove until suddenly my headlights lit up a scene that froze my blood. A man lying in the middle of the road, apparently unconscious or injured, and tucked back in the forest, almost hidden by the thick vegetation. I spotted the disguised outline of a car. The man next to me went rigid instantly, muttering in a hoarse voice for me not to stop, and he didn't even need to say it. I had already realized it was an obvious trap. I tried to swerve enough to avoid running over the body, keeping the car close to the edge of the road. But as if they knew we'd have to slow down, two men burst out from the trees, running straight at us, one of them opening fire in our direction. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor with everything I had, and tore out of there as fast as the old engine would let me. The man beside me, almost hyperventilating, said those men were after him, that if they caught him, he was a dead man. And at that moment, with brutal clarity, I realized that if they caught both of us, there wouldn't be any survivors. I impulsively suggested calling the police, but his reaction was immediate and threatening. He raised the rifle again and warned me he didn't want the cops involved. That's when, far off in the distance, I spotted a pair of strong headlights coming toward us. They were still a ways off, but from my elevated position on the road, I could see they were closing in fast. In a split-second decision, knowing that staying on the main road would be suicide, I killed the headlights and, in a reckless or maybe lucky move, veered off onto a narrow, muddy trail winding deep into the woods. The old car, battered and worn out, groaned under the strain, but I didn't hesitate. I shut off the engine, and we sat there swallowed by darkness and silence, hearing nothing but the deafening pounding of our hearts. 3 minutes passed, 3 minutes that felt like hours before the pursuing car roared past at full speed, never suspecting we were hidden among the trees. From the strength of its lights and the sound of its engine, I realized it was a powerful vehicle. I knew right then that I had made the right call. We stayed hidden a few minutes longer before creeping back onto the road, heading in the opposite direction from where the other car had gone. I didn't turn the headlights back on, driving only by the faint light of the moon and my memory of the road's layout, desperately trying to stay hidden from whoever was out there looking for us that night. For almost an hour, the man sat silently beside me until finally he rested the rifle on his lap and with a hoarse whisper thanked me, saying I could drop him off at the next small town. When we got there, he jumped out of the car and disappeared down the deserted streets without looking back. I didn't stop until I found a small roadside motel where I locked myself in a room and passed out from exhaustion. It wasn't until the next day that I contacted the police. They were extremely cooperative and took the case seriously, questioning me extensively and doing a full investigation. But despite their efforts, they never found the man or any sign of the attackers. About a month ago, I got a call informing me that the case had been officially closed with no further developments. I never found out who the man I saved was or what had gotten him into that situation. All I know is you'll never catch me driving through that part of West Virginia again, even if it means driving around the entire country to avoid it. The story I'm about to tell you isn't particularly long, and it might not seem extraordinary at first, but trust me, it takes a turn. I'll admit, I've never been great at paying attention to detail, and I'm not exactly talented when it comes to describing things with emotion or precision. But if you've got the patience to stick with me until the end, I promise what happened is as absurd as it is real, and it might even make you look at certain situations a little differently. It's not just surreal. To me, it's the ultimate proof that every story has at least two sides, and no matter how convinced we are of our perspective, there's almost always another angle we know absolutely nothing about. It was early spring, and since I've always been a nature lover, I grew up surrounded by it in the small town of Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. I kicked off the season by hitting the trails. I've always loved this time of year. To me, the real new year doesn't begin in January, but when everything starts growing, blooming, and coming back to life. That's when I feel like the world is truly turning again. The plan was simple. Spend 3 full days on one of the Appalachian trails, completely off the grid and fully immersed in nature. But what was supposed to be 3 days of peace turned into 2 days of calm, followed by a 3rd day of fear that stayed with me. I know the area really well, and I've hiked those trails countless times, so I feel confident enough to step off the main paths and explore the wilder, less traveled routes, where the real beauty and solitude still haven't been overrun by tourists. These are places few people ever walk through, where you can go hours, sometimes days, without seeing another soul. I had just left the main trail, aiming to return to a secluded clearing I had camped in the previous year. I remember the place clearly. Two large open spaces separated by a small still water pond surrounded by shade and silence. When I arrived, it looked exactly like I remembered. Peaceful, untouched, beautiful. I set up my tent, organized my gear, and by the end of the day, while gathering some dry wood for a small campfire, I stumbled on something that went far beyond simple unease. I felt a kind of fear so raw and visceral I could barely think straight. I knew that over the years there had been several disappearances in that area, stories I'd always heard with a fair amount of skepticism. But hearing rumors or reading old newspaper clippings is one thing. Stumbling across physical evidence right in front of your eyes is a whole different beast. I was picking up branches when I noticed something sticking out from the undergrowth. As I got closer, I realized it was part of a skull, badly decayed, dirty, covered in moss, and I couldn't immediately tell if it was human or animal. A few feet ahead, though, I found a long bone that I instantly recognized as very likely being a human tibia. That alone would have been enough to freak me out. But what made it worse was the fact that the night before I'd been watching videos I had downloaded to my phone before the trip, stuff about local folklore and serial killers who'd operated in that very mountain region. The combination of those videos and the bones made for one hell of a mental cocktail, and I went into a near constant state of alert. Still, I tried to keep calm. I kept telling myself everything was fine, that there was no need to panic, and that as soon as the sun came up, I'd pack up and leave that place as quickly as I could. But around 11 p.m., I started hearing noises outside the tent. Not super close, but loud enough to make me tense. They sounded like footsteps or movement in the bushes. I froze, my brain running through every possible scenario. Wild animals, people, accidents, escaped lunatics. We all think those things only happen to other people. A few minutes later, I heard water thrashing violently. I had pitched my tent near the pond, and the sounds were coming from that direction. They weren't close, but they were loud and frantic, like something or someone was panicking. I stayed completely still, trying to make sense of it when I clearly heard what sounded like a human sound. I don't know, but at that moment, I knew I couldn't just ignore it. I grabbed the knife I always carry, unzipped the tent slowly, and stepped outside. I moved toward the sounds as quietly as I could, and what I saw is something I still have trouble believing. On the other side of the pond, lit only by pale moonlight, I saw a completely naked man running wildly through the trees. It was such a bizarre sight, almost comical if it hadn't been so damn disturbing in that setting. In the middle of nowhere, no explanation. A guy sprinting naked through the forest like he was running for his life. That was the breaking point for me. I didn't care about anything else. I packed up whatever I could, grabbed my food bag, which I always hung from a branch away from where I sleep, and when I got there, it was all torn apart and scattered on the ground. My first thought was that it had been a bear. That's the whole reason for hanging the food. But if it had been a bear, there would have been more damage, claw marks, and I probably would have heard more chaos. I left the food, grabbed only the essentials, and booked it out of there as fast as I could. As soon as I got to my car, I called the police and told them everything, especially about the bones, which I figured was the most serious part. For weeks, even months, I kept replaying that night in my head. I couldn't figure out what had really happened. The guy clearly wasn't okay, and I kept wondering what had become of him. Was he on something running naked through the forest at midnight? Then one day, while I was scrolling aimlessly through Reddit, I stumbled across a post that chilled me to the bone. It was a story posted by someone named Derek. According to him, he'd been camping at the exact same pond on the exact same night. In his post, he described it being a warm night, and as I later found out, he had a habit of taking midnight swims in these secluded ponds. Thinking he was completely alone, he stripped down and jumped in. He'd been in the water for about 5 minutes when he started hearing noises on the shore. When he turned to look, he freaked out. There was a huge bear rummaging through his clothes, trying to get at the energy bars he'd left in his shorts pocket. The clothes were being torn apart, but then the bear saw him and lost interest in the snacks and gained interest in Derek. The only thing he could do was run completely naked through the opposite side of the pond, deep into the woods. I don't think I've ever felt so stupid and so entertained by a Reddit post at the same time. I messaged him immediately. The noises I'd heard that night were both Derek and the bear. But Derek hadn't seen me, and I hadn't seen the bear. And that's how we met. What started as something terrifying and surreal has become our favorite story to tell. We've become great friends, and since then we've done countless hikes together. Needless to say, we laugh until we cry every time we tell the story of how we met. Most people think we're making it up, and honestly, I don't even blame them. I was born in Wyoming County, West Virginia. That probably doesn't mean much to most people, but to those who've driven the winding hollow roads between Quetta and War, the name alone is enough to conjure a kind of slow, pressing dread. It's a forgotten part of the state. No hospitals, no Walmart, not even a traffic light. You don't come out this way unless you have a reason. And even then, you don't stay long. I left when I was 23. The first stretch of 4-lane road had just opened. Barely 10 miles of asphalt pretending to connect us to the rest of the world. It didn't. The Appalachians don't let go that easy. Even now, years later, I feel like some part of me is still tangled up in those woods. Like something followed me out. There was one particular trip I took back there that I think about more than I should. It wasn't long after I'd left. My uncle had died suddenly, and the family expected me to help sort through his place outside of War. It was the middle of January. Cold had sunk into the ground so deep it felt like even the trees were holding their breath. I hadn't been back in 3 years. The drive from Welch to War is never pleasant. It isn't just the narrow roads, the blind curves, the old coal trucks that still barrel around like they own the place. It's the feeling that the mountains are swallowing you the deeper you go. Between Coalwood and Quetta, the trees close in so tight the sky disappears. There were moments I forgot I was even in daylight. Just curve after curve, trees clawing at the edge of the road. No sign of life except the occasional trailer buried in the brush. I stayed in my uncle's house for 3 days. It was a sagging structure at the base of a ridge, surrounded by rusting cars and stripped appliances. He'd been a reclusive man, a hoarder in the true sense, the kind of person who filled every inch of space with junk because he couldn't stand the silence. I understood that more than I wanted to admit. The first night I didn't sleep, not because I was scared, but because it was so quiet it hurt. The kind of silence that presses into your eardrums, makes you hear the blood in your own veins. Out here, there's no hum of traffic, no distant neighbors, just the wind through the trees and the occasional crack of something shifting in the woods. And God, those woods, they felt alive, not in the mystical enchanted forest sense. No. Alive like something watching, waiting, breathing. On the second day, I decided to hike up behind the house toward an old logging road that used to be active. When I was a kid, the plan was to find a cell signal, maybe get a few bars so I could check in with my brother. As I climbed, I noticed how little had changed. Same muddy ruts, same fallen branches, but there was something else, a sense of weight, like the woods were leaning toward me. I can't explain it better than that. About a mile up, I found a clearing where the ridge dropped off. You could see the whole hollow from there. The house looked like a speck, the road leading into town barely visible. I stood there for a long time, shivering and trying to shake the feeling that I shouldn't be there. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't even fear. It was primal instinct, like I'd stepped out of bounds in a game I didn't know I was playing. Even though I felt like a complete stranger in that area, the truth is, I'd spent countless hours there as a kid, running around and playing with my 2 brothers. When I turned to go back, I saw something that made me pause, not because it was particularly dramatic or startling at first glance, but because it didn't belong. There were prints in the soft leaf-covered dirt, not mine and not fresh, but recent enough to hold their shape against the damp. They trailed off toward the far side of the ridge, veering away from the old paths and moving into terrain so steep and overgrown that no one would choose to walk it unless they had to. The prints and themselves weren't alarming, even though that land still technically belonged to my uncle. It wouldn't have been all that unusual for someone to have passed through there. People wandered through the hills from time to time, hunters maybe, or someone cutting across to another hollow, but the direction felt wrong. Not just unusual, but almost deliberate in its avoidance of where people were supposed to go. I followed their path with my eyes, trying to make sense of the decision someone had made to walk that way. And that was when I saw it, deep among the trees, far enough that I couldn't make out much more than a suggestion of shape. Something or someone was standing completely still. It was just a vertical form, vaguely human, shadowed between two tree trunks where the light didn't quite reach. There was no movement, not even the sway of someone shifting their weight or brushing away a branch. Nothing, but I knew it was looking at me. I couldn't explain how. I couldn't even be sure it was a person. The light was low, but the sensation of being observed was immediate and absolute. I stood frozen for a moment, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden understanding that I had wandered too far into something I didn't fully comprehend. Then came another kind of feeling, a sense of recognition, something old and in a way unsettling, but also strangely comforting, like I'd seen it there before, like I'd grown up with that presence. I didn't call out. I didn't try to convince myself it was a tree or a shadow or anything that might offer more comfort. I just turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if it moved. That night, I locked every door and window, slept with a kitchen knife by the bed, though I never really slept. Every creak in the floorboards felt intentional, like someone was stepping carefully. I knew it was just monkeys in my head, but even so, they were there. I left before dawn. Didn't even bother finishing packing up the place. Told my mom I got what I needed. The plain truth is, for all I cared, that house could rot. On the way home, I called my older brother and asked him directly if he'd ever seen anything or anyone in those woods. He didn't say much about what he'd seen, but he told me he once mentioned it to our grandmother, and she gave it a name. Then he said he'd left all that behind and didn't want to talk about it anymore. I didn't push. Years have passed since then. My mother eventually came to live with me, leaving that part of the country behind. But even after all this time, I still dream about that trail down the ridge, and that same sense of a presence lingering there never really left me. Actually, it's not just sometimes. It's constant, a recurring dream, something I'm not sure I'll ever shake. I often remember my grandmother's words, "You don't need ghosts when you have the mountains. They leak you just the same."